They say you don't really know your family until money's involved. I learned that truth at a Christmas dinner table the night my father looked me in the eye and declared, "Parasites get no food." While my sister Madeline was served prime rib and expensive wine, I sat before an empty plate with nothing but a glass of water. 12 guests watched in silence as my father explained that I hadn't earned my place at this table. The humiliation was designed to be total, complete, unforgettable. What he didn't know, I wasn't the failure he'd convinced everyone I was. I'm a multi-millionaire. I own commercial properties across 3 states. And for the past 5 years, I've owned something else he never suspected, the mortgage on the very house where he was humiliating me. So I did what any self-respecting parasite would do. I smiled a smile that should have terrified him, stood up and walked out. Then, from my car 3 blocks away, I made 3 phone calls that would destroy his world in under 30 minutes. By the time their $2,800 dinner bill bounced, I had 98 missed calls. But this story isn't just about frozen accounts and financial revenge. Because what I discovered next about stolen inheritances, forged documents, and the mother who tried to protect me from beyond the grave will make you understand why some families don't deserve your mercy. They called me a parasite. By the end of this, you'll know exactly who was feeding off whom. And trust me, you won't believe how this ends. My name is Pauline Boyd. I'm 43 years old, and for the past 15 years I've built a commercial real estate portfolio that most people twice my age would envy. But tonight, driving toward my father's house on Christmas Eve, none of that mattered. Tonight, I was just the daughter who had learned long ago to expect nothing and somehow still hoped for something different. The house looked exactly as it always did. White colonial with green shutters, holiday lights wrapped around the porch railings with the precision my father demanded in everything. I sat in my car for a moment, gathering the armor I'd need for the next few hours. Through the front window, I could see guests already arriving, hear the muffled sounds of laughter and seasonal music. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror, smoothed my simple navy dress, and reminded myself that I'd survived worse than a family dinner. The cold hit me the moment I stepped inside, and I don't mean the December air. My father, Richard Boyd, stood in the foyer greeting arrivals with the booming warmth he reserved for people he wanted to impress. He was 68 now, still imposing in his gray suit and red tie, still carrying himself like a man who believed his presence was a gift to any room. When he saw me, his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Pauline," he said, as if my name itself was an afterthought. "You made it. Hang your coat in the back." No hug, no Merry Christmas, just directions to the coat closet. I moved through the house like a ghost, familiar with every corner, but belonging to none of them. In the living room, I found my sister Madeline holding court near the fireplace, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her emerald dress catching the light from the Christmas tree. She was 38, but had the confidence of someone who'd been told her entire life that she was extraordinary. When she saw me, she offered a smile that was all politeness and no warmth. "Oh, Pauline, I didn't know if you'd actually come." "Merry Christmas to you too," I said quietly. The guests began filling the dining room, and I took my usual seat at the far end of the table, the spot that had somehow become mine over the years, close enough to be included, far enough to be forgotten. I watched people arrive, air-kissing, and exchanging wrapped bottles of wine. These were my father's friends, mostly neighbors, business associates, people from his social circles who knew our family only by the image he projected. I recognized Mrs. Chen from next door, a kind woman in her 70s who'd always been gentle with me when I was young. She caught my eye and gave me a small, sad smile that made my chest tighten. As everyone settled, I heard my father introducing Madeline to a couple I didn't recognize. "This is my daughter Madeline," he said, his voice warm with pride. "She's the successful one, working in marketing now, doing very well for herself." He gestured vaguely in my direction. "And that's Pauline, my other daughter." The other daughter, not my eldest, or my firstborn, or even just Pauline. The other one. The qualifier that reduced my entire existence to an afterthought, a footnote to Madeline's story. I felt the familiar sting but kept my face neutral. I'd learned years ago that reacting only gave him ammunition. Instead, I focused on the table settings, the gleaming china and crystal that had been my mother's before she died. I wondered what she would think, seeing me here, tolerated but not welcomed, present but not seen. Elaine, my father's partner for the past 8 years, moved between the kitchen and dining room with practiced efficiency. She was a woman in her early 60s, always impeccably dressed, always hovering at the edges of scenes rather than occupying their centers. For just a moment as she passed behind my chair, our eyes met. I saw something there, sympathy maybe, or recognition, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. She said nothing, did nothing, and continued into the kitchen. The conversations around the table swirled with the easy rhythm of people who belonged. They talked about holiday plans, recent vacations, grandchildren's achievements. Madeline shared a story about a client presentation that went well, and everyone laughed at the right moments, murmured appropriate praise. I sat quietly, hands folded in my lap, trying to make myself as small as possible. It was a skill I'd perfected over decades. Then my father stood up. The room quieted immediately, all attention shifting to him at the head of the table. He picked up his wine glass, and I assumed he was about to make a toast. Instead, he surveyed the table with an expression I couldn't quite read. Satisfaction mixed with something harder, something that looked almost like contempt when his gaze landed on me. "Before we begin," he announced, his voice carrying easily through the suddenly silent room, "I want to establish a principle for this household." He paused for effect, and I felt my stomach drop even before he continued. "In this house, parasites get no food." He gestured directly at me, his finger pointing across the table like an accusation. "Those who contribute nothing have no right to expect anything in return." The silence that followed was suffocating. I heard someone's uncomfortable laugh, quickly stifled. I saw Madeline look down at her plate. Mrs. Chen's face registered shock. But no one spoke. No one said, "Richard, that's cruel," or "You can't be serious," or even, "Perhaps we should just enjoy dinner." They simply sat there, frozen in their discomfort, choosing silence over confrontation. My hands trembled slightly where they rested on the table. I felt heat rising in my face, the humiliation spreading through my body like poison. But I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me break the way he intended. Instead, I felt something shift inside me. It was as if years of accumulated hurt were crystallizing into something solid, something sharp. I'd spent my entire adult life trying to earn a place at this table, trying to prove I deserved my father's respect, his acknowledgement, even the smallest scrap of his approval. And in one sentence, he'd made it clear that nothing I did would ever be enough. The meal service began. I watched as platters were passed around the table, as Madeline's plate filled with perfectly carved prime rib roasted vegetables glistening with butter, twice-baked potatoes, fresh rolls. The wine flowed freely into crystal glasses. The guests ate and drank, their initial discomfort fading as they convinced themselves to ignore what had just happened, to pretend they hadn't witnessed something cruel and deliberate. In front of me sat an empty plate and a single glass of water. My father carved the roast with theatrical precision, making comments about earning your place at the table and the importance of contributing to the family. Every word was designed to diminish me, to remind everyone present that I was less than other than not quite worthy of being here. The symbolism was so obvious it was almost cartoonish, and yet it worked. I could feel the weight of their judgment, their pity, their relief that they weren't the target of this particular cruelty. But something remarkable happened as I sat there before my empty plate. Instead of shrinking further into myself, I felt my spine straighten. My breathing steadied. The trembling in my hands stopped. I looked at my father, really looked at him. And for the first time in my life, I saw him clearly, not as the authority figure whose approval I craved, but as a small, frightened man who needed to diminish others to feel powerful. And I smiled. It wasn't the smile of defeat or resignation. It wasn't the placating smile I'd learned to wear to smooth over uncomfortable moments. It was something entirely different. The smile of someone who'd just made a decision, who'd just seen the chessboard clearly for the first time, and realized they'd been playing the game all wrong. That smile contained years of silent planning, of building something my father knew nothing about, of accumulating power, while pretending to have none. It held the knowledge of bank accounts and legal documents and leverage he couldn't imagine. It was the smile of a woman who'd finally stopped asking for permission to be valued and decided to show them exactly what they'd overlooked. That smile wasn't surrender. It was the first spark of something they would never see coming. As I sat there smiling at my empty plate, memories I'd kept carefully locked away began flooding back. Funny how a moment of crystalline humiliation can make you see your entire life with sudden clarity. I'd been at this table metaphorically, if not literally, my whole life, watching others feast while I convinced myself I didn't need nourishment. I was 7 years old the first time I understood my place in the family hierarchy. It was a school night, and I was struggling with long division at the kitchen table. I remember the frustration of numbers that wouldn't cooperate the way my pencil kept breaking because I was pressing too hard. Madeline, only 3 at the time, was getting ready for bed in the next room, and I could hear my father reading her a story, his voice warm and patient. I called out, "Dad, can you help me with my homework?" The response came back, "Pauline, you're a smart girl, figure it out yourself." So I did. I figured it out myself, and the next assignment and the one after that. I learned to be the child who didn't need help because needing help was inconvenient, and disappointment was worse than struggling alone. By the time I was 9, I'd stopped asking for anything at all. Meanwhile, Madeline grew up wrapped in attention like a blanket. I watched my father sit with her for hours over homework I'd completed independently years earlier. When she brought home a B-, there were celebrations and promises of ice cream. When I brought home straight A's, the response was always the same. "That's what you're supposed to do, Pauline. That's expected." I learned that excellence was not achievement, but obligation, that success was invisible, but failure would be catastrophic. The phrase, "Madeline is our future," became a mantra in our house. My father said it to relatives, to neighbors, to anyone who would listen. He talked about her potential, her brightness, her promising trajectory. And me, I was just there, present but not future, existing but not becoming. I internalized that message so deeply that by the time I was a teenager, I'd stopped imagining a future that included their pride or recognition. I simply planned to survive. My mother saw it, I think. Before the cancer took her when I was 23, there were moments when she'd look at me with such sadness, as if she recognized what was happening, but felt powerless to stop it. She was gentle with me in ways my father never was, but she was also exhausted from illness, from managing my father's moods, from trying to keep peace in a household that ran on unspoken hierarchies. Sometimes I wondered if she stayed quiet about my father's favoritism, because confronting it required energy she simply didn't have. After she died, whatever thin protection I'd had vanished completely. My father's neglect became more pronounced, more deliberate. It was as if losing my mother freed him to stop pretending he saw me at all. College was my escape, but even there the pattern followed me home during breaks. I worked 3 jobs to pay for school because asking my father for tuition felt impossible. He'd already made it clear that his financial investment was reserved for Madeline's future. I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in finance, and when I called to share the news, my father's response was perfunctory. "Good. Now you can get a real job." 2 years later, when Madeline graduated with a C average in communications, he threw her a party and gave a toast about how proud he was of her journey. That was when I truly understood. It wasn't that I needed to achieve more or be better. The game was rigged from the start. Nothing I accomplished would ever matter because I wasn't supposed to be the one who mattered. But here's what my father never understood: being invisible gave me freedom. While he watched Madeline's every move, micromanaging her choices and taking credit for her small victories, I built an entire life he knew nothing about. I started my first property management company at 28 with a mysterious $50,000 investment I never fully understood. but suspected somehow came from my mother's preparations before she died. I worked 70-hour weeks, learned everything about commercial real estate, made strategic investments that others thought were too risky, and I told my family nothing. When they asked about my work, I said I did office management, and changed the subject. I drove a 7-year-old sedan even after I could afford luxury cars. I lived in a modest apartment even after I could have bought a house, because I'd learned something crucial in a family that only values money and status. The ultimate power is controlling both while they remain ignorant of it. The irony, of course, was that they only remembered I existed when they needed something. Every few months, there'd be a call, an unexpected medical bill, a business opportunity that needed quick cash, urgent house repairs that couldn't wait. And like a fool, I'd help. I told myself I was being the bigger person that family meant showing up even when they didn't deserve it. But really, some part of me was still that 7-year-old hoping that if I was useful enough, helpful enough, generous enough, they might finally see me. They never did. The money would solve their crisis, and I'd fade back into invisibility until the next emergency. Madeline's failures were met with sympathy and support. She's going through a hard time, while my successes were met with silence, or worse, suspicion. When I mentioned closing a major property deal, my father's only comment was, "Don't let money make you arrogant, Pauline." These experiences didn't break me, though. Part of me wishes they had. At least then there would have been drama, attention, some acknowledgement that damage had been done. Instead, they forged me into someone extraordinarily resilient and entirely alone. I learned to move through the world needing no one's approval because approval was never coming. I built my empire in secret, celebrating victories in silence, building walls so high that even if they wanted to reach me now, I wasn't sure they could. What my family saw as weakness, my quiet demeanor, my reluctance to argue, my tendency to simply absorb insults and move on, was actually something else entirely. It was the stillness of someone who'd learned to survive in hostile territory. It was strategic withdrawal. It was the patience of someone who understood that visibility made you vulnerable, and that real power grew best in darkness. But beneath all that control, beneath the armor I'd built from years of benign neglect, lived a question I'd carried since childhood. Would they love me if I had nothing to give? If I wasn't useful, wasn't helping, wasn't quietly absorbing their cruelty with grace? Would there be anything left? Or was I only tolerated because I'd made myself indispensable in small, forgettable ways? Tonight, sitting at this table with my empty plate and my glass of water, watching my family and their guests pretend that public humiliation was somehow acceptable, I finally had my answer. And it was the answer I'd always known but hadn't wanted to accept. No. They wouldn't love me no matter what I gave or didn't give because they'd never actually seen me as someone worthy of love in the first place. That realization should have devastated me. Instead, it was strangely liberating. Because once you stop waiting for love from people incapable of giving it, you're finally free to act in your own interest. And I had interests they couldn't begin to imagine. Yet none of them knew who Pauline had truly become or what she was capable of. What my family saw when they looked at me, when they bothered to look at all, was a middle-aged woman in a plain dress driving a practical car, living a forgettable life of quiet desperation. They saw exactly what I wanted them to see. The truth was so far beyond their imagination that hiding it required almost no effort at all. I left home at 22 with $1,200 in savings, a business degree that my father had dismissed as useless, and a determination that bordered on obsession. I wasn't running from my family, I was running towards something they'd convinced me I'd never be capable of achieving. That first year was brutal in ways I still don't like to remember. I worked as an assistant property manager for a small apartment complex, lived in a studio with walls so thin I could hear my neighbors' conversations, and ate more ramen than any human should consume in a lifetime. But I was learning. Every day I watched my boss handle tenant complaints, negotiate with contractors, review financial statements, and I absorbed it all like someone starving for knowledge. I noticed inefficiencies in how buildings were managed, saw opportunities others missed, understood that real estate wasn't just about properties, it was about people timing and the courage to act when others hesitated. At 25, something extraordinary happened. I received a letter from a law firm informing me that an anonymous benefactor had established a trust fund in my name, accessible only to me, with $50,000 designated for business formation or educational advancement. The letter provided no name, no explanation, just account details and a notarized document proving the money was legally mine. I spent weeks trying to trace its origin, but the lawyers cited confidentiality agreements and would reveal nothing. To this day, I believe my mother arranged it somehow before she died. Maybe she'd saved money my father didn't know about, or maybe she'd asked someone to help me after she was gone. I'll never know for certain, but that $50,000 changed everything. It was the seed capital that let me start Boyd Property Management, my own small company handling residential properties for landlords who didn't want the headache of daily operations. I was methodical in ways that surprised even me. Every decision was researched, every risk calculated, every dollar accounted for. Within 3 years, I'd expanded from managing properties to acquiring them. I bought my first small apartment building at 28, a 6-unit complex in a neighborhood everyone said was declining. I saw what they didn't: good bones, proximity to a university, and potential that just needed vision and investment. I renovated it unit by unit, increased its value by 40%, and used the equity to buy 2 more buildings. The business grew through relentless discipline and strategic thinking. I reinvested every profit, took calculated risks that others found too aggressive, and worked hours that would have broken someone with a social life to maintain. But I had no social life. I had a mission. By 35, I'd shifted from residential to commercial properties, office buildings, retail spaces, mixed-use developments. I brought in partners for larger deals, established Boyd Holdings LLC, and built a portfolio that included properties across 3 states. At 40, I acquired significant shares in a regional bank that was undervalued due to temporary market conditions. That investment alone would have made me wealthy, but it was just one piece of a carefully constructed empire. Today, Boyd Holdings manages assets worth $23 million. I employ 47 people. I sit on 2 corporate boards. Industry publications have featured my success story, though I always decline to be photographed or use my full name in interviews. And my family knows none of it. When my father asks what I do for work, I say, office management, in a tone that suggests it's boring, and we should change the subject. When Madeline once asked where I live, I gave her an address for a modest apartment I rent specifically for mail, not the 3-bedroom condo I actually own in the city's nicest district. I drive a 7-year-old Honda Civic that runs perfectly well, even though my garage also houses a car I never drive to family functions. I wear clothes from department stores and carry a practical handbag. Not because I can't afford better, but because luxury would raise questions I'm not ready to answer. This invisibility became my greatest strategic advantage. My father respects only 2 things: money and the power it brings. If he knew about my wealth, he wouldn't suddenly love me or respect my intelligence or apologize for decades of neglect. He'd simply recalibrate his exploitation. I'd become the family bank expected to fund every whim and emergency while still receiving no acknowledgement beyond what I could provide financially. The ATM would just have a larger balance. But I wasn't content with merely building wealth they didn't know about. I was preparing. 5 years ago, I learned through a contact at my bank that my father had fallen 90 days behind on his mortgage. The bank was preparing to accelerate the loan. I saw an opportunity that was almost poetic in its justice. Through one of Boyd Holdings' subsidiary LLCs, I purchased the mortgage at a slight discount. The bank was happy to offload a troubled loan, and I became quite literally my father's creditor. The notice of mortgage transfer was sent to his official address of record, a P.O. box he'd opened years ago for business mail, and promptly forgot about because Elaine handles all the household bills. He never saw it. For 5 years, he's been making his monthly mortgage payments to BH Property Services, a name that means nothing to him, never realizing that every check was being deposited into an account controlled by the daughter he calls a parasite. I kept records of everything else, too. Every time he called asking for money, I documented the stated reason and tracked how the funds were actually spent. That $8,000 for emergency dental work in 2015, his credit card statements, which I could access through the mortgage file, showed charges at a casino that same weekend. The $15,000 for critical roof repairs in 2017, no contractor was ever hired. The pattern was clear and documented. They lied to me, used me, and never once considered that I might be keeping score. I also documented the insults. I kept a private journal of every dismissive comment every time I was introduced as the other daughter, every family gathering where my accomplishments were ignored while Madeline's mediocrity was celebrated. It wasn't for revenge exactly, or maybe it was, but I told myself it was for clarity, so I wouldn't gaslight myself into thinking the neglect wasn't real or wasn't that bad. Tonight, sitting at this table watching them feast while I'm publicly declared unworthy of food, I realized something. All that preparation, all those years of patient documentation and strategic positioning had been leading to this exact moment. Not because I'd planned this specific humiliation, but because I'd been building the tools to respond when the inevitable finally happened. My father thought he was putting me in my place. He had no idea he'd just freed me to show him exactly where his place really was. Tonight would be the night they finally met the real Pauline Boyd, and learned what happens when you call a lion a parasite. But my father wasn't finished. Having made his declaration about parasites having positioned me before my empty plate while others enjoyed their feast, he seemed energized by the performance. He took a long sip of wine, surveyed his audience with the satisfaction of a man who believes he's won something important, and continued. "You know what I find fascinating?" He said, his voice carrying that false lightness people use when they're about to say something cruel but want plausible deniability. Pauline is 43 years old, 43. Never been married, no children, no real career to speak of. Living hand to mouth as far as I can tell. He gestured toward me with his wine glass as if I were an exhibit in a museum of failure. And yet she shows up here expecting to be treated like she's accomplished something. A few guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Someone coughed. But no one spoke up. No one said, "Richard, that's enough," or "This isn't appropriate dinner conversation." They simply sat there, complicit in their silence, and my father took that silence as encouragement. I mean, at some point, you have to ask yourself where you went wrong, don't you? He looked directly at me now, as if this were a genuine question requiring my response. Your sister managed to build a life. She has relationships, ambitions, plans for the future. But you... He shook his head with theatrical disappointment. You just sort of exist, taking up space, expecting others to carry you. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, my water glass untouched before me. I knew if I reached for it, my hands might shake, and I refused to give him that satisfaction. Instead, I focused on my breathing, on keeping my face neutral, on not providing the emotional reaction he was clearly fishing for. I'd learned long ago that showing hurt only fueled him, that my pain was entertainment. We should be grateful we even invited her, my father continued, and now there were actual chuckles from a few guests. Nervous laughter, the kind people produce when they're uncomfortable but don't want to appear judgmental of the host. Though I'm not sure she could afford the gas money to get here on her own. More laughter, slightly louder this time. I glanced around the table and saw varying degrees of discomfort and complicity. Some people stared at their plates. Others exchanged meaningful looks with their spouses. Madeline was studying her wine glass as if it contained the secrets of the universe. But Mrs. Chen, the elderly neighbor who'd lived next door for decades, looked genuinely distressed. Her kind face was creased with concern, and she kept glancing between my father and me as if trying to understand how this was happening, why no one was stopping it. The humiliation was so complete, so calculated, that it transcended ordinary cruelty. This wasn't a moment of anger or a loss of control. This was planned. My father had thought about what he wanted to say, had crafted his little speech, had decided exactly how he wanted to diminish me in front of an audience. It felt less like family tension and more like active hatred, like he needed to destroy me to prove something to himself. I sat there watching him perform his dominance, and something strange happened. The hurt that had been threatening to overwhelm me began to transform into something colder, clearer. I felt myself detaching, as if I were watching this scene from a great distance, observing rather than experiencing. And from that distance, I could see him clearly, a frightened man who needed an audience for his cruelty, because without witnesses, his power meant nothing. The conversation eventually moved on, as conversations do, flowing toward safer topics. Someone mentioned the unseasonably warm weather. Someone else praised the quality of the roast. The guests were eager to pretend the previous minutes hadn't happened to reset the evening's tone to something more comfortable. But then my father steered us into even darker waters. "Actually, I'm glad we have everyone here tonight," he announced, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "Elaine and I need to discuss something important. We've had contractors out to assess the roof, and it needs complete replacement. The estimate came in at $35,000. He paused, letting the number settle over the table. Now, as the oldest child, Pauline will naturally be contributing the majority of that cost. It's only fair given that Madeline has her own young family to support. I felt the absurdity of the statement like a physical blow. Madeline was 38, single and childless. She had no young family to support. But facts had never mattered in my father's version of reality. He'd decided on a narrative: Madeline as the overburdened younger daughter, me as the older sister, with nothing else to drain my resources, and the truth was simply adjusted to fit. What struck me most was that this wasn't framed as a request or even a discussion. It was a declaration. No one asked if I could afford $35,000. No one inquired whether I wanted to contribute or felt this was a fair distribution of financial responsibility. It was simply announced as my obligation, my duty, my family sacrifice. The phrase made me want to laugh. Sacrifice implied giving up something valuable for a worthy cause. This was extortion dressed up in the language of filial duty, and I knew exactly what would happen next because I'd seen this pattern play out half a dozen times before. There would be an emergency that required immediate funding. I would be guilted into providing money I supposedly didn't have. The emergency would somehow resolve itself or morph into something else entirely. And months later, I'd see evidence of my money funding Madeline's vacation, or my father's country club membership, or some other expense that had nothing to do with the stated crisis. The guests began gathering their things shortly after sensing perhaps that the evening had soured beyond recovery. They offered polite thanks and made their excuses, eager to escape the toxic atmosphere my father had created. I stood to leave as well, retrieving my coat from the back closet, when I felt a gentle touch on my arm. Mrs. Chen had pulled me aside away from the others. Her elderly face was lined with concern, and something else, anger maybe, or deep sadness. She leaned close and spoke in a whisper, meant only for me. "Honey, this family has never deserved you, and everyone on this street knows it." The words hit me with unexpected force. This was a woman who'd lived next door for 30 years, who'd watched me grow up, who'd witnessed countless family interactions through the thin veil of suburban proximity. She had no stake in our family dynamics, no reason to take sides, no benefit from telling me this truth. And yet she'd chosen to speak up to offer validation that my own family had never provided. If neighbors could see the injustice clearly, why had I tolerated it for so long? As I moved toward the door, I noticed my father's tablet sitting on the side table in the foyer, its screen still glowing. For just a second, I glimpsed what looked like a LinkedIn page, someone's professional profile, before my father noticed my glance and quickly snatched the device away, pressing it against his chest protectively. The movement was sudden, almost panicked, and his expression flickered with something I couldn't quite read. Defensiveness. Guilt. I filed the observation away, adding it to the growing collection of strange details that didn't quite fit the narrative my family presented. But in that moment, standing in the foyer of the house where I'd spent my childhood being overlooked, listening to the echo of my father's cruel performance still ringing in my ears, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. Something inside Pauline didn't just break, it crystallized into diamond-hard resolve. I stood up from the table with the kind of calm that comes from having finally made a decision you've been postponing for years. My movements were deliberate, unhurried. I picked up my water glass, still full, still untouched, and set it down precisely in the center of my empty plate. The small sound of glass meeting china seemed unnaturally loud in the suddenly quiet room. "Thank you for dinner," I said, my voice level and clear. "Merry Christmas to you all." The words were perfectly courteous. I could have been thanking them for a lovely evening, expressing genuine holiday wishes. But something in my tone made it clear this wasn't "see you next week" or even "goodbye for tonight." This was goodbye in a much more permanent sense. I wasn't slamming doors or making dramatic pronouncements. I was simply stating a fact: this chapter was closed. I gathered my coat from the closet, taking my time, refusing to scurry away like someone who'd been successfully shamed. The room behind me had fallen into the kind of silence that feels heavy, oppressive. I could feel their eyes on my back, could sense the confusion rippling through the dinner guests. They'd expected tears or anger or pleading. They'd expected me to break down or fight back or beg for another chance to prove my worth. This composed departure didn't fit the script my father had written. As I walked toward the door, I caught a glimpse of Richard's face. For just a moment, he looked unsettled, as if he'd realized something had shifted, but couldn't quite identify what. Elaine stood near the kitchen doorway, her expression unreadable. Part concern, part something else I couldn't name. It almost looked like admiration, though that seemed impossible. I didn't say another word. I simply walked out into the December night, pulled the door closed behind me with a quiet click, and descended the front steps to my car. The Christmas lights strung along the neighboring houses blurred slightly in my peripheral vision, but not from tears. My eyes were dry. What I felt was clarity so sharp it was almost painful, determination so focused it eliminated everything else. I drove exactly 3 blocks before pulling over into the parking lot of a closed grocery store. My hands were steady on the wheel. My breathing was even. For years I'd imagined what it might feel like to finally stand up to my father, and I'd always pictured rage or grief or some explosive combination of both. Instead, I felt cold and clear and ready. I pulled out my phone and made the first call. My attorney, David Chen, no relation to my kind neighbor, answered on the second ring despite the late hour. He was used to my occasional after-hours calls regarding time-sensitive business matters. "David, I need you to invoke the acceleration clause on the Boyd Holdings mortgage, the property at 1247 Maple Street." My voice was steady, businesslike. Richard Boyd missed 3 monthly payments 18 months ago during what he called a business emergency. Under the terms we structured when purchasing that loan, any missed payment gives us the right to call in the full remaining balance. I want that done tonight. There was a brief pause. David had handled enough of my business to know I didn't make impulsive decisions, but even he seemed surprised by the timing. "Pauline, it's Christmas Eve. Are you certain about the timing on this?" "Completely certain. File the acceleration notice immediately. I want it official before midnight." "Understood. I'll handle it within the hour." The second call went to my chief financial officer, Janet Martinez, who'd been with Boyd Holdings since the early days when we were just managing 6 apartment units. "Janet, I need you to implement a full legal hold on any credit lines connected to the Maple Street property. The mortgage is being accelerated, which means the underlying asset is now in dispute. Contact the relevant banks and ensure they understand the situation. This needs to happen tonight." Janet asked no questions beyond the practical logistics. "I'll make the calls. Should take about 45 minutes to reach all the relevant parties." The third call was to my head of legal, Marcus Williams, who oversaw compliance and documentation for all Boyd Holdings operations. "Marcus, I need a complete compilation of every financial transaction between me personally and Richard Boyd over the past decade. Every loan, every gift, every emergency payment. I want the stated purposes compared against actual expenditures where we have documentation. I need this ready for review by Monday morning. That's a substantial request, Marcus said carefully. Should I understand this as preparation for potential legal action? Understand it as preparation for clarity, I replied. I want an accurate accounting of reality versus fiction. As I ended the third call, I sat in my car feeling something I hadn't experienced in years, the absolute certainty that I was doing exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment. This wasn't revenge born from rage or spite. This was a surgical strike executed with the precision of someone who'd been preparing for years without fully realizing it. The legal mechanism was elegant in its simplicity. When I'd purchased my father's mortgage 5 years ago through a Boyd Holdings subsidiary, my attorneys had structured it with an acceleration clause standard in many mortgage agreements, but rarely invoked. The clause stated clearly that if the borrower missed any scheduled payment, the lender had the right to declare the entire remaining loan balance immediately due and payable. My father had missed 3 consecutive payments during his so-called business emergency, then caught up over the following months. He probably thought the matter was resolved forgotten, but that missed payment history gave me the legal right to accelerate. By invoking the clause, I wasn't directly freezing his bank accounts that would be illegal. What I was doing was declaring the mortgage in default, which meant the property was now considered a disputed asset. And when a property becomes disputed, banks automatically freeze any lines of credit secured against that property. It's standard banking protocol designed to protect the lender's interests. My father had been living off his home equity line of credit for years, using it like a checking account for everything from daily expenses to luxury purchases. I'd seen the statements when I purchased the mortgage. That credit line was his financial lifeline. And in approximately 30 minutes, when the banks received notice of the mortgage acceleration and property dispute, that lifeline would be cut. Not by me directly, but by the entirely predictable and legal response of financial institutions protecting their interests. The dinner he'd just hosted, the wine he'd served, the decorations strung across his house, all of it likely charged to that credit line. And very soon, that well would run dry. His credit cards, his ability to make purchases, his access to the funds he'd been using to maintain his lifestyle, all of it depended on that home equity line remaining open. I sat in my car in that empty parking lot, Christmas lights twinkling in the distance, and watched the minutes tick by on my dashboard clock. Somewhere across town, David was filing paperwork. Janet was making calls to banks. Marcus was pulling files and building documentation. The machinery of financial consequences was grinding into motion, precise and unstoppable. Within 30 minutes, Richard's world would begin to collapse, and he would have no idea his daughter was the architect of his destruction. I drove home slowly, taking the long route in no particular hurry. The streets were quiet on Christmas Eve, most families already settled in for the night. I wondered how long it would take for the notifications to start hitting Richard's accounts. David had said within the hour. Janet would need about 45 minutes to reach all the relevant banks. The timing was precise, mathematical, satisfying in its predictability. By the time I pulled into my building's underground parking, my phone had already started buzzing. I glanced at the screen. Richard. I let it go to voicemail. Then another call immediately after. Madeline this time. I silenced the ringer and carried my phone upstairs, feeling its persistent vibration against my palm, like the heartbeat of something dying. My condo was exactly as I'd left it, clean, quiet, decorated with a small tree in the corner that I'd put up more out of habit than holiday spirit. I poured myself a glass of wine, settled into my home office chair, and finally looked at my phone. 14 missed calls in the 20 minutes since I'd left the parking lot. I set the phone face up on my desk and watched the screen light up again and again, each call a small drama I could observe from a distance. Meanwhile, 3 miles away, my father was discovering what happened when you built your life on borrowed money and borrowed time. I imagined the scene clearly because I knew Richard so well. He would have tried to settle the bill with the caterer after the last guests left, expecting the usual smooth transaction. He always used his home equity credit card for entertaining. It had a high limit, and he treated it like free money, like the house itself was a magical reservoir that never ran dry. I pictured his confident smile fading when the first card declined. The confusion on his face as he tried another card, then another. The caterer's patient but increasingly uncomfortable expression. My phone buzzed with a text from Madeline. "Something's wrong with Dad's credit cards. Mine too. Do you know anything about this?" I didn't respond. Another call from Richard, then a voicemail notification. I played it on speaker, curious to hear his voice now that his world was shifting beneath him. "Pauline, it's your father. There's some kind of problem with the bank accounts. Everything's frozen. I need you to call me back immediately. This is urgent." His voice was tight with controlled panic, still trying to maintain authority, even as he asked for help. I deleted the voicemail and took another sip of wine. The notifications would be cascading now, I knew. When a home equity line freezes, it doesn't just affect new charges, it triggers automatic reviews of all recurring payments tied to that account. The bank's systems would be mechanically processing failures one after another, the utility companies submitting their monthly charges and receiving rejection codes, the insurance company's automatic withdrawal, bouncing the country club membership that Richard valued so highly suddenly in arrears. A text from an unknown number appeared. "Ms. Boyd, this is Catherine from Premier Catering. We've attempted to process payment for tonight's service, but all payment methods have been declined. Please contact us to arrange alternate payment. Balance due, $2, $847.52. I forwarded the message to my personal accountant with a note. "Do not pay. They can pursue collection through normal channels." More calls, more texts. The messages were evolving. I noticed scrolling through them. Early ones were confused and questioning. Middle ones became demanding, edged with anger. The most recent ones carried undercurrents of threat. Madeline's latest, "If you did something to Dad's accounts, you'll regret this." Richard's, "Whatever game you think you're playing, it ends now. Call me." But I wasn't playing a game. Games had rules agreed upon by all participants. This was something else entirely, the natural consequence of decades of taking without giving, of exploiting without appreciating, of viewing me as a resource rather than a person. My phone showed 53 missed calls now. I opened my laptop and logged into my secure portal, checking to confirm that all the mechanisms I'd set in motion were proceeding as planned. David had filed the acceleration notice at 9:51 p.m., 4 minutes ahead of schedule. Janet had successfully contacted all 3 banks that held lines of credit secured against the Maple Street property. The freezes were in place. Marcus had already compiled preliminary documentation spanning 12 years of financial interactions between me and my family. Everything was moving with the precision of a well-designed machine. I stood and walked to my window, looking out over the city lights. Somewhere out there, my father was probably still on the phone with his bank's automated system, navigating endless menus, trying to reach a human being who could explain why his financial life had suddenly seized up. Madeline was probably crying or raging or both. Elaine was likely trying to manage 2 people in crisis while Googling terms she didn't understand. And I felt nothing but a profound, settling calm. This wasn't the vindictive satisfaction I'd feared I might experience. It wasn't pleasure in their pain. It was simply the quiet relief of finally protecting myself. Of saying enough, not with words but with actions. Of drawing a boundary so clear that even they couldn't pretend to misunderstand it. My phone continued its relentless buzzing. 68 missed calls, then 71. The voicemails were piling up faster than I could delete them. Text messages filled my screen, mostly variations on the same themes: confusion, demands, threats. Not one of them said, "I'm sorry for how we treated you," or "We need to talk about what happened tonight." Just, "Fix this and call us back," and "You've gone too far." I poured a second glass of wine and returned to my office, where I began drafting an email to my attorney outlining the next steps. We would need to schedule a formal meeting, probably after the holidays. I would need to prepare for the inevitable confrontation, though, on terms I controlled this time. I was thinking about venue options, neutral territory, my attorney's office somewhere they couldn't use home field advantage when my phone rang again. Another unfamiliar number. I almost let it go to voicemail with all the others, but something made me hesitate. Maybe it was intuition. Maybe it was simple curiosity. I answered without speaking, waiting to hear who'd found my private number. "Pauline, it's Elaine." Her voice was quiet, careful, completely different from the demanding tones of Richard and Madeline's messages. "I know what you did, and I think you should have done it years ago. We need to talk privately." I sat in my car outside the Starlight Diner at 11:30 on Christmas Eve, watching Elaine through the plate glass window. She sat alone in a corner booth, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug, looking more tired than I'd ever seen her. The diner was nearly empty, just a lone trucker at the counter and an elderly couple in another booth. The fluorescent lights were harsh and unflattering, making everyone look slightly ill. It felt like the right setting for whatever this conversation was going to be. I'd driven here half expecting an ambush, some coordinated effort to guilt me into undoing what I'd done. But Elaine had chosen a location 40 minutes from the house, far enough that Richard couldn't follow even if he knew where we were. Still, I kept my phone in my hand as I walked inside, ready to document anything that felt like coercion or manipulation. Elaine looked up as I approached, and her first words stopped me in my tracks. "I'm not here to beg you to undo what you did," she said quietly. "I'm here to tell you that you're right, and I'm ashamed I didn't have the courage to say it at dinner." I slid into the booth across from her, studying her face for signs of deception. She looked back at me with steady eyes, no trace of the careful neutrality she usually maintained around Richard. This was a different Elaine, or maybe this was the real one finally visible. "I've been with your father for 8 years, she continued, "and I've watched what he does to you, how he treats you. Tonight was the worst I've witnessed, but it wasn't the first time, and we both know it wouldn't have been the last." She paused, taking a shaky breath. I felt powerless to intervene. "I'm not family. I'm the partner who came later, the outsider. Anytime I've suggested he was too harsh with you, he shut me down completely. Said I didn't understand your history, your difficulties, your failures." The way she said that last word made it clear she didn't believe Richard's characterization of me. "Then why are you here?" I asked, my voice more guarded than I intended. "Because tonight, something broke in me too. Watching him humiliate you like that, and I just stood there. I didn't speak up, I didn't defend you, I was complicit." Her hands tightened around the coffee mug. "And I realized I've been complicit for 8 years and I can't do it anymore. So I'm asking, how can I help?" I sat back, genuinely stunned. Of all the scenarios I'd imagined for this meeting, this wasn't one of them. Elaine reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope, setting it carefully on the table between us. "Before I explain what's in here, I need to tell you something about your mother. She had a sister, my sister, Margaret." "I don't understand," I said. "My mother never mentioned a sister." "They were estranged. Family politics, old wounds, the details don't matter now. But Margaret never stopped following your mother's life from a distance. And when your mother died, Margaret felt tremendous guilt for not reconciling while she had the chance." Elaine's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "So she decided to watch over you instead. Margaret followed your career, kept track of your milestones, and when she learned you were starting a business, she wanted to help. She was the one who arranged the $50,000 investment when you were 28. The room seemed to tilt slightly. The mysterious seed capital that had launched Boyd Holdings, the anonymous benefactor I'd wondered about for 15 years, it was my aunt, an aunt I'd never known existed. 3 years ago, Margaret died, Elaine continued. Cancer like your mother. Before she passed, she left me letters explaining everything. She'd made me promise years earlier that if anything happened to her, I'd watch over you. Make sure Richard didn't destroy you completely. Elaine's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. That's why I started dating your father, Pauline. Not because I loved him, because I'd promised my sister I'd protect you from inside the family structure. I felt like I'd been punched in the chest. You've been with him for 8 years as some kind of guardian mission. I thought I could make a difference. I thought if I was there, I could moderate his worst impulses, stand as a buffer between you and his cruelty. She looked down at her hands. But all I did was enable him by staying silent. I watched him use you, manipulate you, take your money and your time and your emotional labor, and I documented it all while doing nothing to stop it. She pushed the envelope toward me. Inside was a flash drive. 8 years of documentation. Financial records showing exactly where your money really went when Richard claimed emergencies. Text messages between him and Madeline coordinating their stories to guilt trip you which sister would call you, what emotional angle to use, how much to ask for. Voice memos of your father rehearsing tonight's speech. He planned the parasite comment for weeks, Pauline. He practiced it. This wasn't spontaneous cruelty. This was premeditated. I felt sick. Knowing my father was cruel was one thing. Having evidence that he'd planned my humiliation like a theatrical performance was something else entirely. There's more, Elaine said. Your father has been following your career obsessively for years. He has folders on his tablet, screenshots of your LinkedIn articles about Boyd Holdings, photos of you receiving awards. He knows you're successful. He's known for years. The parasite comment, the story about you living hand to mouth, it was all psychological warfare. He was trying to keep you feeling small despite your achievements. I remembered that glimpse of his tablet in the foyer, how protective he'd been when I glanced at the screen. He'd been looking at my profile, studying my success while simultaneously denying it existed. Why? I asked. If he knows I'm successful, why pretend otherwise? Because if he acknowledges your success, he has to acknowledge that you did it without him. That you're more competent than he is. That you don't need him. Elaine met my eyes. And if you don't need him, he can't control you. Your independence terrifies him, so he tries to convince you and everyone else that it doesn't exist. I sat in that diner booth processing 8 years of secrets, and I realized that Elaine had given me something far more valuable than evidence. She'd given me context, an explanation for behavior that had never made sense. And more than that, she'd given me the knowledge that someone had been seeing the truth all along, even if she'd lacked the courage to speak it until now. There's one more thing, Elaine whispered, leaning closer. Your mother left something for you that Richard stole, and I can prove it. I stared at Elaine across the table, my coffee growing cold between my hands. What did he steal? Let me explain something first, she said. About who your father is and why he became this way. It doesn't excuse what he's done to you. Nothing could, but you deserve to understand the full picture. She took a breath, gathering herself. Richard's parents called him a parasite when he was 25 years old. Those exact words. He'd been living at home while trying to start a business, and one night at a family dinner Christmas, actually, his father stood up and announced that parasites who contributed nothing to the household would no longer be welcome. Then he told Richard to pack his things and leave. The parallel was so obvious it made my skin crawl, history repeating itself with such precision it couldn't be coincidence. They cut him from their will entirely, Elaine continued. Wrote him out completely and told everyone in the family why. When they died 15 years later, the house went to Richard only because there were no other heirs left. The lawyers had to give it to him by default. It wasn't inheritance, it was leftovers. The final insult was that even in death, his parents made it clear he was only getting their property because no one better wanted it. I thought about the house where I'd been humiliated tonight, the same house Richard had inherited from parents who'd despised him, the same house he'd used as a stage to recreate his own trauma with me playing the role he'd once occupied. He built his business from that devastation, Elaine said, worked himself nearly to death to prove them wrong, but the wound never healed. It festered, and when he had daughters of his own, all that unresolved pain needed somewhere to go. So, he gave it to me, I said quietly. He gave it to both of you, just in different ways. Elaine's expression was pained. After his parents died, Richard saw a therapist for about 6 weeks. The therapist told him he was repeating his trauma through his children, that he was becoming his father, that he was using the same weapons on you that had been used on him. Do you know what Richard did? Let me guess. He quit therapy. He never went back. He told me once that the therapist didn't understand family dynamics and was turning him into the villain of his own story. He couldn't face what he was doing, so he stopped looking. I felt a strange mixture of anger and something uncomfortably close to pity. My father had been handed a chance to break the cycle, and he'd chosen to perpetuate it instead. Richard is terrified of dependence, Elaine explained. His parents used his need for their approval as a weapon. Every time he needed something, money, support, acknowledgement, they made him beg for it and then denied him anyway. They trained him to see asking for help as weakness and needing others as shameful. So now he weaponizes other people's need for his approval, especially yours. When you were young and still trying to earn his love, he had maximum control. The more independent you became, the more threatened he felt. Because I reminded him of his own weakness, I said, the pieces clicking together. Exactly. When he calls you a parasite, he's not really talking to you. He's talking to himself at 25. He's expressing the self-loathing he never resolved. He's trying to make you feel what his parents made him feel, as if by passing the pain to you, he can finally be free of it himself. I understood it intellectually, but understanding didn't create forgiveness. That explains the psychology, but it doesn't change what he did. He chose this. Every single time he chose cruelty over courage. I know, Elaine said softly. I'm not asking you to forgive him. I'm giving you context, so you understand this was never about you. It was always about him. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. There's something else you should know about the family dynamics. Richard deliberately pitted you and Madeline against each other. He kept Madeline dependent through overpraise and financial support, making her his validation proof he could be a good parent unlike his own father. He pushed you away through criticism, making you his scapegoat, a vessel for all the self-hatred he couldn't face. Why those roles? I asked. Why couldn't I be the validation too? Because you're too much like him, Elaine said. Strong, independent, resilient. When he looks at you, he sees everything he wishes he'd been at 25, everything he was too broken to become. That's threatening. Madeline is easier. She needs him, depends on him, and that makes him feel powerful. With you, he only feels inadequate. I thought about all those years of watching Madeline receive praise for mediocre achievements while my actual successes went unacknowledged. It had never been about merit or fairness. It had been about Richard's psychological needs. When you started succeeding despite him, Elaine continued, it shattered his entire narrative. He couldn't take credit for your success because you'd done it without his support. In fact, you'd done it in spite of his active sabotage. So he had only 2 choices: acknowledge your strength and face his own failure, or deny your success existed at all. He chose denial, I said. He chose denial, Elaine confirmed. And he recruited Madeline into that denial, consciously or not. Every time he praised her and ignored you, he was reinforcing the story he needed to believe that the daughter who needed him was valuable, and the daughter who didn't was worthless. I sat with that truth, feeling it settle into place alongside all the other painful realizations of the evening. My father was a wounded man, perpetuating cycles he lacked the courage to break. He'd been given the chance to heal, to become something better than what his parents made him, and he'd chosen the easier path of repetition instead. Understanding this added complexity, but not sympathy. It transformed him from a simple villain into something more tragic, a man who'd been destroyed by his parents and then chose to destroy his own child, rather than face his pain. In some ways, that made it worse. He'd known exactly what he was doing, because it had been done to him. There's one more thing, Elaine said, her voice dropping even lower. And this is the hardest part to tell you. I braced myself, though I couldn't imagine what could be worse than what I'd already learned. When your mother died, she left a trust fund specifically for you. $200,000 designated for your education and starting a business. She knew Richard would favor Madeline. She wanted to make sure you had resources of your own. Elaine met my eyes. Richard was the executor. He never gave you a penny. The words hung in the air between us like something solid I could touch. $200,000. A trust fund from my mother. Money that was supposed to be mine at 25, the exact age when I was struggling to launch my business, eating ramen for dinner and sleeping 4 hours a night because I was terrified of failing. He stole it, I said, my voice flat with shock. He did, Elaine confirmed. And I have the original trust documents that Margaret kept. Your mother's handwriting, her signature, her explicit instructions that this money was for you and only you. I left the diner at 1 a.m. with a flash drive in my pocket, and a fury so cold it felt like clarity. I didn't go home. I drove to my office building, let myself into the empty space where my team would arrive in a few days, and spent the rest of Christmas night reading through Elaine's files. Then I sent messages to my forensic accountant and my attorney. Emergency. Need you both first thing after the holiday. This is urgent. The weekend passed in a blur of documentation and discovery. My forensic accountant, Linda, arrived at my office Saturday morning and didn't leave until Sunday evening. What she uncovered made me physically ill. My mother had established the trust 6 months before she died when she knew the cancer was winning. The document was heartbreakingly specific. $200,000 to be held in trust for Pauline Marie Boyd to be distributed to her in full upon reaching age 25 or earlier, at the discretion of the trustee if needed for education, business formation, or home purchase. This fund is established because I know my daughter will need support that her father may not provide, and I want to ensure she has resources to build a life of her own choosing. My mother had seen me. Really seen me. She'd known Richard would favor Madeline, known I'd be left to fend for myself, and she'd tried to give me a safety net, a financial foundation, proof that someone believed in my future. Richard, as executor and trustee, had legal authority to distribute the money according to the trust's terms. When I turned 25, he should have simply transferred the funds to an account in my name. Instead, he filed paperwork with the probate court claiming the funds were urgently needed for family medical expenses following Mrs. Boyd's death, and requesting permission to use trust assets for immediate family welfare. The judge, dealing with a backlog of cases and seeing what appeared to be a grieving widower trying to handle medical debt, approved the request. But Linda's forensic trace told a different story. That $200,000 hadn't gone to medical expenses. It had been transferred into an account Richard controlled, then systematically spent over the following decade on everything except emergencies. Madeline's car at 23 purchased outright $31,000 from the trust. Her study abroad trip to Europe at 24, $18,000 from the trust. Designer clothing purchases, spa memberships, the remodeled kitchen Richard claimed he'd saved for all from the trust. My mother's money meant for me had funded my sister's entire lifestyle while I worked 3 jobs and wondered if I'd ever make rent. Here's what makes it legally actionable, Linda explained, her finger tracing lines on a spreadsheet. The trust was never officially closed. Richard files an annual tax form claiming the trust is still active and being managed for the beneficiary's future benefit. He makes small withdrawals each year. Last year it was $3,200, and documents them as trust management and beneficiary support. But you've never received a penny. That's ongoing fraud. Each false filing resets the statute of limitations. I stared at the paper trail of betrayal. My father had been stealing from me for 20 years, not in one dramatic theft, but in the slow, methodical embezzlement of everything my mother had tried to give me. And he'd been lying to the government about it annually, documenting his theft in official paperwork that claimed he was managing money for my benefit. The money had funded Richard's country club membership. It had covered Madeline's credit card bills when she overspent. It had paid for home renovations and vacations and all the appearances of prosperity that made my father feel successful. Not one emergency, not one legitimate expense that aligned with my mother's intentions. But what devastated me wasn't the money itself. Yes, $200,000 would have changed my life at 25. It would have meant less fear, fewer sleepless nights, maybe even the luxury of making mistakes without risking total ruin. But I'd succeeded anyway. I'd built my empire through pure determination and that mysterious $50,000 gift from Aunt Margaret. What destroyed me was understanding what had been stolen, my mother's final act of love. Her last attempt to protect me, to tell me I mattered, to give me tangible proof that someone had faith in my future. Richard had taken that message and erased it, spending my mother's voice on luxuries and lies. I thought about all those years in my 20s when I'd questioned everything about myself, when I'd wondered if I was the problem, if I deserved the family's contempt, if maybe they were right, and I was just inherently less worthy than Madeline. The evidence of my mother's love had existed all along, proof that she'd seen my value, believed in my potential, wanted to ensure my success. And my father had buried that evidence while spending the money it represented on the daughter he'd chosen to favor. Every time I'd struggled living on ramen and doubt the money meant to ease that struggle was buying Madeline another dress. Every time I'd called home hoping for encouragement and received criticism instead, the proof of my mother's faith in me was being systematically embezzled and erased. My father hadn't just stolen money. He'd stolen the knowledge that I'd been loved by the person who mattered most. I sat in my office Sunday evening, surrounded by documents that proved my father was not just cruel but criminal, and I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about justice for a profound betrayal, not just of me, but of my mother. She'd used her final months to protect me, and he'd spent 20 years dismantling that protection for his own benefit and ego. On Monday morning, I met with my attorney David and showed him everything. His expression grew darker as he read through the documents. "This is prosecutable," he said finally. "Executor fraud, ongoing embezzlement, false filings. The evidence is overwhelming." Elaine's words from the diner echoed in my mind. "Your success was built on nothing but your own strength," she'd said quietly. "His comfort was built on stealing from a dead woman and her daughter. Now what are you going to do about it?" I looked at David and made my decision. 3 days after Christmas, I returned to the house that had been the site of my humiliation. But this time I didn't arrive alone, and I didn't come as the dismissed daughter seeking scraps of approval. I came with David Chen, my attorney Linda Martinez, my forensic accountant, and Elaine, who'd texted me that morning. "Richard and Madeline will both be there. I made sure of it." My father opened the door, and his face immediately shifted from confusion to anger when he saw my entourage. "What is this, an ambush?" he demanded, blocking the doorway. "This is a conversation that's 20 years overdue." I said, my voice calm and level. "We can have it here, or we can have it in a courtroom with a judge present. Your choice." Something in my tone made him step aside. We filed into the house, and I led them directly to the dining room, the same room where I'd sat before an empty plate 4 nights ago. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone, least of all Richard. Madeline was already seated at the table, her eyes red-rimmed, her usual confidence completely absent. She looked at me with something between fear and resignation, as if she'd been expecting this moment but hoping it would never come. "Sit down," I told my father. It wasn't a request. He sat. I opened my briefcase and began laying documents across the dining room table with methodical precision. Each page had been tabbed, highlighted, organized for maximum clarity. Trust paperwork bearing my mother's signature. Transfer records showing Richard's requests to the probate court. Bank statements tracing every dollar of the stolen $200,000. Credit card receipts matching the trust withdrawals. Tax filings claiming the trust was being managed for beneficiary benefit. And finally, a forensic accounting report tracking 20 years of embezzlement. The silence in the room was absolute. David and Linda stood behind me, professional witnesses to this reckoning. Elaine positioned herself near the kitchen doorway, present, but not intrusive. Richard stared at the documents spreading across the table like evidence of a crime scene, which is exactly what they were. "This," I said, tapping the first document, "is a trust established by Eleanor Marie Boyd 6 months before her death. In it, she left $200,000 specifically to me to be distributed when I turned 25. The purpose is stated clearly: education, business formation, or home purchase. She knew I'd need support that you wouldn't provide, Dad. She wrote it explicitly." I slid the document toward him. He didn't touch it, but I saw his hands trembling on the table. "This," I continued, moving to the next set of papers, "is your request to the probate court claiming the trust funds were urgently needed for family medical expenses. The judge approved it because you were a grieving widower, and the request seemed reasonable." I paused, letting that sink in. "But these," I spread out the bank statements, "show where the money actually went." Madeline made a small sound, almost a whimper, as she recognized receipts with her name on them. The car purchase, the Europe trip, clothing stores she'd frequented in her 20s. Her face drained of color. "$31,000 for Madeline's car," I read from Linda's summary. "$18,000 for her trip abroad, $12,000 for the kitchen remodel, $8,000 for country club dues." The list goes on. Not $1 went to the medical expenses you claimed. Not $1 was saved for my benefit. Every penny of Mom's gift to me was spent on luxuries for you and Madeline. Richard tried to speak, but no words came out. I'd never seen him at a loss for words before. It was both satisfying and heartbreaking. "But the worst part," I said, my voice dropping lower, "isn't the money, it's this." I picked up the trust document and read my mother's handwriting aloud, words she'd written knowing she was dying, words my father had deliberately kept from me for 20 years. "I worry Richard will overlook Pauline because she's not needy like Madeline. This money is to make sure my strong daughter knows I saw her strength even if he doesn't. Pauline has always been the responsible one, the capable one, the child who asks for nothing because she learned early that asking means disappointment. I want her to know that I saw her. I valued her. I believed in her future. This gift is not charity. It's recognition of worth that her father may never acknowledge." My voice cracked on the last sentence. Just once, just for a moment, the professional composure I'd maintained slipped, and I felt the full weight of what had been stolen. Not money, but my mother's voice. Her final words to me. Her attempt to counteract the very neglect she'd witnessed and felt powerless to stop. "How do you steal a dead woman's love letter to her child?" I asked, looking directly at my father. He had no answer. His mouth opened and closed, but nothing emerged. Beside him, Madeline was crying silently, tears streaming down her face, as she understood that her entire adult life, the life she'd thought she'd earned through being the good daughter, had been funded by theft. Even David, who'd seen plenty of family betrayals in his legal career, looked shaken. "There's one more thing you should know," I said, pulling out the final set of documents. "You've been wondering how your accounts got frozen. Let me clarify that for you." I slid the mortgage paperwork across the table. 5 years ago, when you fell 90 days behind on your mortgage payments, the bank prepared to foreclose. I bought your loan through Boyd Holdings. The transfer notice was sent to your P.O. box, the one you opened for business mail, and then forgot about because Elaine handles all the household bills. You never saw it. You never knew. Richard picked up the document with shaking hands, scanning the pages, seeing his own property address, his own loan number, his own signature on the original mortgage, now assigned to BH Holdings, LLC. "For 5 years," I continued, "you've been making mortgage payments to my company. Every single check you wrote for your house payment was made out to me. You've been financially dependent on the daughter you called a parasite, and you never even knew it." I let him sit with that realization, watching the blood drain from his face as he understood the full scope of his delusion. His power had always been an illusion. His authority over me had been maintained only because I'd chosen to let him believe it existed. I gathered my documents, slipping them back into my briefcase with the same methodical precision I'd used to display them. David and Linda stepped back, prepared to leave. Elaine remained motionless near the doorway, a silent witness to the collapse of everything Richard had built his identity upon. "So tell me, Father," I said, standing to leave. "In this house, who really is the parasite, the daughter who built an empire, or the man who stole from the dead?" The silence after my question stretched so long I thought no one would break it. Richard sat frozen, staring at the mortgage documents as if they might change if he looked at them hard enough. I was preparing to leave when Madeline suddenly pushed back from the table, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You want to talk about lies?" Her voice was shrill, desperate. "You want to talk about who knew what Dad's been stalking Pauline's career for years?" I caught him reading her Forbes interview in the bathroom like some obsessed fan. Richard's head snapped up. "Madeline, don't." But she was already moving toward his den, and I realized she was trying to deflect attention from her own role as the beneficiary of stolen money. If she could make this about Richard's behavior instead of the car she'd driven and the trips she'd taken with my mother's money, maybe she could escape some of the guilt weighing down the room. She returned with Richard's tablet, shoving it toward me across the table with such force it nearly slid off the edge. "Look at it. Just look." I caught the tablet and unlocked it. Richard hadn't changed his password from the default, which told me something about his relationship with technology. What I found made my stomach turn. Folders. Meticulously organized folders with labels like Pauline Career, Boyd Holdings, Awards and Recognition. I opened the first one and found dozens of screenshots from my LinkedIn profile dating back at least 3 years. Every job update I'd posted, every article I'd shared about commercial real estate, photos of me at industry conferences, my profile picture from 2 years ago, then the updated one from last year. The second folder contained saved articles, a piece from a local business journal about Boyd Holdings' expansion into the tri-state area, a mention in Forbes about emerging female entrepreneurs in commercial real estate, an interview I'd given to a trade publication about sustainable development practices. Every single article had been saved, some of them printed to PDF with annotations. The third folder was photographs. Me receiving a Top 40 Under 40 award 3 years ago, the image clearly captured from the organization's website. A photo from a charity gala where I'd been honored for community investment. A candid shot from a real estate conference where I was speaking on a panel. My father hadn't just known about my success. He'd been documenting it obsessively, cataloging my achievements with the attention to detail of someone conducting surveillance. I opened one of the annotated articles and found handwritten notes in the margins added digitally with a stylus. Next to a paragraph describing Boyd Holdings' asset portfolio, Richard had written, "She's too independent." Next to a quote from me about financial self-sufficiency, he'd noted, "She doesn't need us anymore." And at the bottom of an article about my charitable giving in letters that looked pressed hard enough to indent the screen, "How do I keep her from leaving?" The surveillance wasn't admiration. It wasn't even pride. It was fear. He'd been tracking my success to measure his loss of control, monitoring my achievements, to calculate how much longer he could maintain his psychological dominance over me. "He checks it almost every day," Madeline said, her voice quieter, now drained of its earlier hysteria. "I've seen him, scrolling through your LinkedIn, reading articles about your company, looking at photos of you at events. Sometimes he just stares at your profile picture like he's trying to figure something out." I looked at my father, and he couldn't meet my eyes. His face had gone from gray to ashen, and I realized Madeline's revelation had exposed something he'd wanted desperately to keep hidden. "You knew," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "All those times you called me a failure, implied I was broke, suggested I couldn't afford gas money, you knew it was a lie." Richard said nothing. "You've known for years that I'm successful, that I've built something real, that I'm financially secure." I held up the tablet, the screen displaying a screenshot of a Forbes mention. "You saved this article. You read it. You knew." The pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity. The parasite comment at Christmas dinner hadn't been ignorant cruelty. It had been calculated psychological warfare. Richard had called me worthless and dependent, knowing I was a millionaire, knowing I'd bailed him out financially multiple times, knowing I'd succeeded far beyond his own modest achievements. Why? I asked. If you knew the truth, why pretend otherwise? Finally, he spoke, his voice rough. Because if I acknowledged it, I'd have to acknowledge that you did it without me, that you're more capable than I am, that you don't need— He stopped abruptly. That I don't need you, I finished for him. And if I don't need you, you can't control me. I scrolled through more of his notes, each one revealing the same underlying terror. He wasn't tracking my career out of fatherly pride. He was monitoring me like a threat, trying to find weaknesses, calculating strategies to keep me tethered to a family that gave me nothing but pain. The Christmas dinner humiliation suddenly made perfect sense. I'd been visiting less frequently over the past year, responding to his demands for money less quickly, creating subtle distance. He'd felt me pulling away, felt his control slipping, and he'd responded the only way he knew how, by orchestrating a public degradation designed to put me back in my place, to remind me and everyone watching that no matter what I'd achieved, I was still his to diminish. You planned it, I said, looking at him with something beyond anger, beyond hurt. The parasite comment, the whole performance. You knew it would humiliate me in front of guests. You knew it was cruel. And you did it anyway because you needed to reassert dominance you were terrified of losing. I just wanted you to remember your place, Richard said quietly, and I could hear the defeat in his voice. He knew the truth was out now that the game was over. My place, I repeated. And where is that exactly? Below you, beneath Madeline, forever grateful for whatever scraps of attention you deign to give me. I stood, setting his tablet down on the table with careful precision. David and Linda were already gathering their things. Understanding this conversation had reached its natural conclusion. Elaine remained by the doorway, her expression unreadable. I looked at my father with new understanding, and I realized it was somehow worse than hatred. Hatred I could fight against, could use as fuel. But this calculated maintenance of delusion, this deliberate denial of reality, this weaponization of my need for his love against me, this was something more insidious. You didn't call me a parasite because you believed it, I said, my voice steady, despite the emotions churning inside me. You called me that because you knew I was stronger than you'd ever be. You weren't putting me down. You were trying to drag me down. I moved from the dining room into the living room, the space where I'd spent countless holidays being systematically overlooked. David and Linda followed, understanding that this confrontation wasn't finished. Richard and Madeline remained at the table, but I could hear them stand and follow moments later, drawn by the gravity of what was happening. I opened my leather portfolio, the same one I carried to board meetings and contract negotiations, and pulled out a document I'd prepared over the weekend. 15 years of financial transactions between me and my family, each one meticulously documented with receipts, bank statements, and verification of how the money had actually been spent. Since we're having a conversation about parasites and who contributes what, I said, my voice steady, I think we should look at the actual numbers. I began reading aloud methodically, letting each item land before moving to the next. March 2015, $8,000 for what you claimed was emergency dental work. Your credit card statement from that same week shows charges at the Riverside Casino totaling $7,200. No dental office appears anywhere in your records. Richard opened his mouth to protest, but I continued without pausing. June 2017. $15,000 for critical roof repairs that couldn't wait. I contacted the 3 contractors you supposedly consulted. None of them have any record of work commissioned or performed at this address. The roof was never fixed because there was nothing wrong with it. I glanced up briefly. Madeline had gone pale. Richard was staring at his hands. October 2019, $22,000 for medical bills you claimed weren't covered by insurance. I obtained records from every hospital and medical facility in the area. There were no outstanding charges. Your insurance had covered everything. That money went to a complete kitchen remodel you told the neighbors you'd been saving for. The list continued. Each false emergency, each manufactured crisis, each guilt trip that had convinced me family meant helping without question. The business investment that became Madeline's BMW, the urgent home repairs that turned into a vacation, the family emergency fund that paid country club dues for 3 years. The total, I said, setting down the papers, is $127,000 in direct transfers over 15 years. Money I gave you believing your lies about emergencies and necessities. Money you spent on luxuries while telling me and everyone else that I was the family burden. I walked to the center of the room, to the spot where Richard used to sit in his leather chair dispensing judgment and criticism, the throne of his petty kingdom. I stood there now, and he remained standing awkwardly by the dining room doorway. "You called me a parasite," I said, and my voice was calm, but it cut like surgical steel. "Let's examine that word, shall we? A parasite lives off another organism, taking resources without contributing anything in return." I held up the financial summary Linda had prepared. For 15 years, I contributed $127,000 in direct transfers. I contributed the mortgage you've been paying to my company for 5 years, another $48,000, though you didn't know where it was going. And then there's the $200,000 trust fund you stole from my inheritance. That's $375,000, Father. Nearly $400,000 that flowed from me to you. I paused, letting the numbers settle over the room like weight. And what did I receive in return? Public humiliation, emotional neglect, zero acknowledgement of my existence except when you needed money, being introduced as the other daughter, having my accomplishments dismissed as expected while Madeline's mediocrity was celebrated, being told I was worthless, dependent, a burden. I took a step toward him. Meanwhile, you've built your entire comfortable life on 3 income sources: Mom's life insurance payout, my financial bailouts, and money you stole from my inheritance. Your house, your lifestyle, your social standing, all of it exists because of money that came from me, or should have gone to me. Another step. So tell me, Father, who's the parasite? The daughter who built a multi-million-dollar company from nothing, or the man who spent 20 years feeding off her? For the first time in my entire life, my father had no response. No bluster about how I didn't understand, no deflection about how I was being dramatic, no rage to redirect attention. He just stood there, and I watched him visibly crumple. His shoulders sagged. His hands started shaking. His eyes watered. He suddenly looked like what he was, an old man who'd built his sense of self on delusions that had just been systematically dismantled. Madeline was staring at the floor, unable or unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. She knew she'd been living on stolen money, wearing stolen clothes, driving a stolen car. The realization of her complicity was written across her hunched posture. I felt Elaine's hand on my shoulder, a gentle touch of solidarity, of support. She'd been waiting years for this moment, for me to finally stand up and speak the truth she'd been documenting in silence. The silence stretched painfully. I wasn't going to fill it. I'd said what needed to be said, and now I would wait for Richard to respond, even if that response was nothing at all. Finally, in a voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it, he whispered, "I was terrified you'd realize you didn't need us." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even close to taking full responsibility. But it was the first crack in the armor he'd worn for as long as I could remember, the first acknowledgement that his cruelty had been driven by fear, rather than by any actual failing on my part. I didn't comfort him. I didn't rush to fill the awkward space or make it easier for him. I simply looked at him and said, "That fear doesn't give you the right to destroy me." The truth of that statement hung in the air. Fear explained behavior, but it didn't excuse it. Being wounded didn't give you permission to wound others. His terror of abandonment didn't justify 20 years of systematic emotional and financial abuse. I walked toward the entryway to retrieve my coat, ready to leave this house and this confrontation behind. David and Linda were already moving toward the door, their professional duties complete. We'd documented everything, exposed everything, and now it was time to go. But as I reached for my coat, David cleared his throat. "Before you go," he said, his voice carrying a note of concern that made me pause. "There's something else you should know. Your father filed a fraudulent document yesterday." I turned back from the door, my coat still in hand. "What kind of document?" David pulled out his phone and opened an email, his expression grim. "Yesterday afternoon, your father attempted to file a quitclaim deed with the county recorder's office. The document claims that during a private family meeting on Christmas Day, you verbally agreed to transfer ownership of the property at 1247 Maple Street back to a family trust, and that you signed documentation to that effect." The words took a moment to register. Christmas Day, the day he called me a parasite and I walked out. Exactly. The document includes what's supposed to be your signature, but it's a rather poor forgery. He appears to have copied your signature from old checks. The handwriting analysis software flagged it immediately as inconsistent with your actual signing patterns. I felt cold spread through my chest. He tried to steal my property. He tried to create a legal document claiming you'd given it back, David clarified. If he'd filed it Monday morning as planned, and if it had gone unnoticed in the system for even 6 months, it would have significantly complicated your legal ownership. We'd have eventually proven it was fraud, but the property would have been tied up in litigation for years. Linda spoke up, her voice carrying a note of disbelief I rarely heard from her. I only caught it because David had asked me to flag any and all property records connected to this address after we invoked the mortgage acceleration. The recorder's office has an online queue system that shows pending filings. I saw it Saturday morning and immediately had our attorneys file an emergency block. I looked at my father, who was still standing in the same spot, his face now completely drained of color. He knew he'd been caught, again. "You did this yesterday?" I asked, my voice eerily calm. "After I froze your accounts. After you knew I had power over your finances. Your immediate response was to try to forge legal documents to steal the one asset I control that you can't access any other way." Richard said nothing, but his silence was confirmation enough. The realization settled over me like a weight. My father would rather commit felony fraud than admit dependence on me. He was willing to risk going to jail because forgery of property documents could carry a 2 to 5 year sentence, rather than accept that his daughter had power he didn't. This wasn't just desperation. It was pathological. And worse, it meant he'd learned nothing from today's confrontation. He wasn't remorseful about his behavior toward me. He wasn't processing the magnitude of what he'd done wrong. He was strategizing his next move, looking for any angle to escape accountability and reassert control. I'd come here hoping for acknowledgement. Maybe even in some small corner of my heart I barely wanted to admit existed the beginning of repair. Instead, I discovered that my father saw me as an enemy to be defeated by any means necessary, including criminal acts. "There's something else you need to know," David continued, his voice taking on the careful tone he used when delivering particularly difficult news. "The district attorney's office will have to be notified. This type of fraud, attempting to forge documents to illegally transfer a 7-figure property, is automatically prosecutable. It's not the type of crime where the victim's cooperation is optional." Behind me, I heard Elaine gasp. Madeline, who'd been quiet since her own revelation about Richard's stalking, started crying harder. "What does that mean exactly?" I asked, though I already knew. "It means the DA will open an investigation whether you want them to or not. They'll want your testimony, your signatures for comparison documentation, proving you never agreed to any transfer. If they prosecute, and given the clear evidence they likely will, your father could face significant prison time. Forgery involving property fraud is a serious felony." I turned to look at Richard again. He was staring at his hands now, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. He looked smaller, somehow diminished, but I couldn't tell if that was shame or just fear of consequences. The choice crystallized before me with brutal clarity. I could cooperate fully with the prosecution, ensure my father faced the full legal consequences of his actions, which would likely mean prison time at his age. It would be justice, certainly. It would ensure he couldn't try something like this again. But it would also mean I was the daughter who put her father in prison, and whatever microscopic chance remained of any family relationship would be obliterated completely. Or I could try to convince the DA not to prosecute, argue for leniency, maybe negotiate some kind of deferred sentencing, but that might look like enabling. It might send the message that Richard could commit crimes without real consequences, as long as he targeted me. And there was no guarantee he wouldn't try something else the moment he thought he could get away with it. For women my age and older, I knew this dilemma was painfully familiar. How many of them had faced similar impossible choices, protecting themselves versus protecting family seeking justice versus maintaining connections, drawing boundaries versus being labeled vindictive? There was no clean answer, no choice that didn't come with unbearable costs. "I need time to think," I said finally. "This isn't a decision I can make standing in this living room." I moved toward the door again, David and Linda falling into step behind me. Elaine remained frozen near the dining room, looking torn between the man she'd been living with and the woman she'd promised her sister she'd protect. Madeline was still crying quietly. As I reached the doorway, I heard Richard speak, his voice low but just loud enough to carry across the room. It was meant to be under his breath, but the house's acoustics betrayed him. "She's always been vindictive." I stopped, turned, looked at him with absolute clarity. In that moment, whatever small part of me had been hoping for reconciliation, for acknowledgement, for any shred of genuine remorse, it died. He'd stolen from me, humiliated me, forged documents in my name, and his takeaway was that I was the vindictive one, that I was the problem, that my response to 20 years of abuse was somehow worse than the abuse itself. "David," I said, my voice perfectly steady, "schedule a meeting with the DA's office. I'll cooperate fully with their investigation." After leaving my father's house that day, I spent 72 hours thinking about narrative control. Richard had spent my entire life controlling the story of who I was, the failure, the burden, the ungrateful daughter. He'd told that story so consistently, so convincingly, that even I had half believed it for years. And now, as legal proceedings began, I realized he'd continue telling that story to anyone who would listen. The vindictive daughter who turned on her family, the cold woman who'd rather destroy her father than forgive him. I could stay silent and let him shape the narrative, or I could tell the truth myself. I contacted Rebecca Martinez, a journalist I'd followed for years, who wrote thoughtful human interest pieces for a platform called Second Act Stories, a podcast and publication aimed at women over 50 navigating life transitions. Her work wasn't sensational or exploitative. She told complex stories about real women facing real challenges, always with nuance and respect. If I was going to share my story publicly, it would be with someone who understood that truth rarely came in simple packages. Rebecca met me at my office on a Thursday afternoon, and we talked for 3 hours. I told her everything: growing up invisible, building my business, the Christmas dinner humiliation, discovering the stolen inheritance, my father's forgery attempt. I showed her documentation, not all of it, but enough to prove I wasn't inventing grievances. "I want to be clear about something," I told her as we finished. "I'm not naming my father or sister publicly. I'll refer to them only as my father and my sister. I'm not trying to destroy their reputations. I'm trying to tell my truth." Rebecca nodded, understanding the distinction. "That actually makes the story more powerful. It's not about revenge or public shaming. It's about one woman finally protecting herself." The interview aired the following Tuesday as a 45-minute podcast episode titled "The Invisible Daughter When Family Love Becomes Financial Abuse." I listened to it once alone in my office with the door closed and was surprised by how calm my voice sounded. I'd expected to hear pain or anger, but instead I heard someone who'd simply decided to stop carrying shame that had never belonged to her. Within 48 hours, my phone was inundated with messages. The podcast platform crashed briefly from traffic. On social media, our Parasite story began trending, though I'd never used a hashtag in my life. The response was overwhelming and frankly unexpected. Thousands of women shared their own stories. Women who'd been the responsible child, punished for their competence while siblings were coddled and praised. Women whose parents had exploited their success while calling them selfish. Women who'd given money for decades to family members who showed nothing but contempt in return. The comments filled with phrases I recognized intimately. I thought I was the only one. My family does this too. I've been called ungrateful for setting boundaries. Many women specifically related to the experience of being successful but never acknowledged. One woman wrote, "I'm a retired surgeon. My brother never finished college, but at every family gathering my parents bragged about him and introduced me as also here. Your story gave me permission to stop showing up." Another, "I supported my parents for 20 years. When I finally said no to another loan, my mother told everyone I'd abandoned them. I believed I was a bad daughter until I heard your interview." The response wasn't just from individuals. Organizations working with elder financial abuse reached out saying my story illustrated patterns they saw constantly but struggled to name. Therapists contacted me asking permission to share the interview with clients dealing with family estrangement. It had struck a cultural nerve I hadn't known existed. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly my anonymity would dissolve. I'd protected my family's identity, never mentioning the city we lived in or any identifying details. But I'd underestimated the power of local recognition. People in my father's community knew exactly who the story was about. Old Mrs. Chen was the first to go public. She gave a follow-up interview to the same platform using her full name. "I've lived next door to Richard Boyd for 30 years, and I know exactly who that daughter is. Pauline has been helping families in this neighborhood for a decade. She paid my medical bills when I had cancer $18,000 anonymously, though I found out it was her. She's helped at least a dozen families with rent, groceries, emergency expenses. Meanwhile, her father tells anyone who'll listen that she's a failure who never amounted to anything." Another neighbor, James Patterson, came forward. "Pauline Boyd funded college scholarships for 3 kids on our street, including my nephew. Full tuition books, everything. She asked only that we not tell anyone who the donor was. But I'm telling now because people need to know who she really is." A third testimonial came from the owner of a local business. "Pauline bought my building when I was 6 months behind on the mortgage and about to lose everything. She gave me a 5-year lease at below market rates so I could stabilize. Never mentioned it to anyone. That's who Richard Boyd's daughter actually is." The community validation transformed the narrative from family drama into something larger, a story about the discrepancy between private character and public performance, about who gets credit for goodness and who gets blamed despite evidence to the contrary. The attention made me uncomfortable. I hadn't shared my story seeking recognition or praise. I'd shared it to stop carrying someone else's false narrative about who I was. But I couldn't control how the truth landed once it was spoken. 3 days after the interview aired, Elaine called me. Her voice was strained. "Pauline, I think you should know. Richard listened to the full interview twice. He hasn't said much, but an hour ago he closed his laptop, stood up, and told me, 'I know what I have to do.' Then he went into his office and closed the door. I'm worried about what that means." Elaine's concern proved warranted, but not in the way either of us expected. Richard didn't hurt himself or disappear. Instead, he began experiencing something that for him was perhaps worse than any legal consequence I could have imposed: social death. Elaine called me daily with updates, her voice increasingly worried. "He went to church this morning. People who usually greet him warmly just nodded and walked past. One woman he's known for 15 years saw him coming and literally turned around to avoid him. He came home and hasn't spoken since. And the next day, the poker game he's attended every Thursday for a decade was canceled. Jim called to say the group is taking a break, but Richard knows what that means. He's been disinvited." By the end of the week, the country club sent a letter. Multiple members filed complaints about his presence, making them uncomfortable. His membership is under review pending an ethics committee hearing. He's not allowed on the premises until it's resolved. I listened to these reports with complicated feelings. This wasn't what I'd wanted when I gave the interview. I'd wanted to tell my truth, not orchestrate his social destruction. But I also understood that I couldn't control how people responded to information. The community wasn't turning on Richard because I'd asked them to. They were responding to learning what many had suspected for years. Elaine told me people were confronting him directly now. At the grocery store, a former friend had approached him and asked, "Is it true what they're saying about how you treated your daughter?" Richard had apparently stammered something about family matters being private, but his denial rang hollow. Too many people had witnessed his treatment of me at community events, heard him introduce me as the other daughter, listened to him brag about Madeline while dismissing my existence. "They're not canceling him based on the podcast alone," Elaine explained. "They're confirming what they already knew. Mrs. Chen's interview opened the floodgates. Now people feel permission to acknowledge what they saw but stayed silent about." For my father, whose entire identity was built on social standing and community respect, this collapse was catastrophic. I knew his history, knew that his own parents had humiliated him publicly before cutting him off. Social shame was his deepest wound, the injury that had never healed and had in fact metastasized into the need to control and diminish me. Now he was experiencing that shame again, but from a position that offered no moral high ground. When his parents rejected him, he could cast himself as the victim, the wronged son trying his best. This time he was unmistakably the perpetrator. There was no spinning this story to make himself sympathetic. Elaine reported that Richard had stopped leaving the house entirely. He moved from bedroom to kitchen to his office, a circuit of rooms that grew smaller each day. When she tried to talk to him, he either exploded in defensive rage or retreated into depressive silence. There was no middle ground, no productive conversation. "He watches your interview constantly," she told me. "He's listened to it at least a dozen times. Sometimes he pauses it and sits there staring at nothing. I think he's trying to understand how it came to this, but he can't get past seeing himself as the victim of your vindictiveness." That detail struck me as particularly tragic. Even confronted with overwhelming evidence of his own behavior, hearing my calm recounting of facts he couldn't dispute, he was still trying to make himself the wronged party. Madeline was facing consequences too, though different ones. Elaine told me Madeline had lost her marketing job after the firm received complaints from clients who didn't want to be associated with that family from the podcast. It seemed harsh. Madeline hadn't been the primary abuser, but I understood the calculation. In a service industry built on relationships and reputation, association with scandal was liability. Her social life had collapsed as well. Friends who used to meet her for brunch were suddenly too busy. Dating app matches who'd seemed promising would Google her name and unmatch without explanation. She wasn't facing the same level of condemnation as Richard, but the message was clear. Complicity had costs. "She keeps saying she didn't do anything wrong," Elaine reported. "She says she was just being loyal to her father, that families should support each other. But I think she's starting to realize that watching abuse happen and benefiting from it isn't the same as innocence." I wondered if Madeline would use this moment to genuinely examine her choices, or if she'd simply redirect blame onto me. Would she ask herself why she'd accepted cars and trips funded by stolen money? Why she'd never questioned the dramatic discrepancy in how we were treated? Or would she decide I was the villain who'd destroyed her comfortable life? Meanwhile, I was trying to maintain normalcy in my own life. I went to work, took meetings, reviewed contracts. But the attention from the interview made everything surreal. Strangers recognized me at coffee shops. Women approached me in parking lots to share their own stories of family estrangement. A literary agent contacted me about writing a book. It was overwhelming and disorienting. Through it all, Elaine kept me updated on Richard's deterioration. He wasn't eating properly, he wasn't sleeping. He oscillated between watching my interview obsessively and drafting long, rambling emails to me that he never sent. Elaine found them in his drafts folder: accusations, justifications, pleas for understanding, threats of legal action, all contradicting each other, all unsent. "I'm worried about what he might do," Elaine said during one of our calls. Not physically, I don't think he'd hurt himself or anyone else. But he's desperate to regain control of something, anything. And desperate people make dangerous choices. Her words proved prophetic. 2 days later, she called me with genuine fear in her voice. "Pauline, he did something. I don't know exactly what yet, but he spent 3 hours locked in his office making phone calls. When he came out, he looked triumphant, like he'd won something, and all he said was, 'She thinks she can destroy me publicly. We'll see who has the last word.'" What Richard had done, I learned the next morning, was contact a public relations firm specializing in reputation management. He'd spent 3 hours outlining his version of events, painting himself as the victim of a vindictive daughter who'd turned a family disagreement into a public spectacle. The firm had drafted press releases, prepared counter-narratives, and identified sympathetic outlets that might run his side of the story. Elaine discovered this when she found the contract on his desk along with a payment authorization for $15,000 money he didn't actually have access to, given that his accounts were still frozen. The PR firm had agreed to work on credit based on his promises about assets he'd soon recover. I learned all this in a meeting with David and Assistant District Attorney Rebecca Walsh, a woman in her 50s who specialized in elder fraud and family financial crimes. She'd reviewed all the evidence regarding Richard's forged quitclaim deed, and her position was unambiguous. "This isn't a gray area," Rebecca said, spreading the documents across her conference table. "Your father attempted to forge your signature on a legal document transferring a 7-figure property. The handwriting analysis is conclusive. The timeline proves premeditation. And his current attempts to manage his public image rather than taking accountability suggest he'd try something similar again if given the chance." David nodded in agreement. "Financial crimes against family members typically escalate when there are no legal consequences. The pattern is clear. He stole your inheritance. He forged property documents. He's now trying to manipulate public perception. If you don't draw a line here, where do you draw it?" From a pure justice standpoint, they were right. Richard deserved prosecution. He'd broken the law deliberately, not in a moment of passion, but through calculated planning. He'd committed fraud, and fraud had consequences. "What kind of sentence are we talking about?" I asked. "Given his age and the dollar amount involved, probably 2 to 4 years if convicted," Rebecca said. "He'd likely serve 18 months to 2 years of that with good behavior." I tried to imagine my 68-year-old father in prison and felt sick. Not because I thought it would be unjust he'd earned those consequences, but because sending him there felt like I was becoming exactly what he'd always accused me of being: vindictive cold, the daughter who destroyed her family. "I need to think about this," I told them. That evening, Elaine called and asked if we could meet privately without Richard or lawyers present. We returned to the same diner where she'd first revealed the truth about my mother's sister, about the stolen inheritance, about Richard's surveillance of my career. It felt fitting somehow to have this conversation in the same place where so many revelations had unfolded. Elaine looked exhausted. She'd aged visibly in the weeks since Christmas, the stress of living with Richard's deterioration taking its toll. She ordered coffee, but didn't drink it, just wrapped her hands around the mug, as if seeking warmth. "I'm not here to make excuses for him," she began. "Everything you've learned is true. Everything he did was wrong. But I want you to understand what prison would actually mean. He'd be held accountable for his crimes," I said, though not unkindly. "He'd be destroyed," Elaine corrected gently. "Not physically maybe, but spiritually. Richard has untreated depression stemming from his parents' abuse. He's never properly processed that trauma. Prison won't rehabilitate him. It'll kill something essential in him, and he'll die whenever that comes, angry and bitter with no chance of ever becoming better than what his parents made him." I wanted to say that wasn't my problem, that he should have thought about consequences before committing fraud. But Elaine pressed on. "I know he deserves punishment. I know justice matters. But I want you to ask yourself a different question." She finally met my eyes. "Not what does he deserve, but what do you need in order to heal Will? His imprisonment give you closure, or will it just create a different kind of wound?" The question hit me harder than I expected. I'd spent weeks thinking about justice, about accountability, about making sure Richard couldn't hurt me again. But I hadn't thought clearly about what I actually needed. Did I need him in prison? Or did I need something else? Boundaries, acknowledgement, assurance that he couldn't continue the pattern I spent 3 days working with David and Rebecca to craft an alternative. A deferred prosecution agreement that would satisfy the justice system's need for accountability while giving Richard a chance, probably his last one, to become something better than he'd been. We presented it to Richard at his house with Elaine and our attorneys present. The contract was clear and non-negotiable. Richard and Elaine could continue living in the house rent-free for 3 years, but they'd be responsible for all utilities, property taxes, and basic maintenance. Richard would attend weekly financial counseling and family therapy with attendance records sent directly to David's office. Any attempt to sell, encumber, or transfer the property would trigger immediate prosecution for both the forgery and the original theft of my trust fund charges that would likely result in 5 to 8 years of prison time. If Richard complied for the full 3 years, the criminal charges would be dismissed and the house would convert to a life estate. He and Elaine could live there until their deaths, after which it would transfer to a charitable foundation I was establishing for women escaping family financial abuse. But if he violated even one term, missed a single therapy appointment, tried any financial maneuver, made any attempt to undermine the agreement, the full weight of prosecution would come down immediately. "This is your choice," I told him. "Accept these terms and you stay in your home, get help, and have a chance to change. Reject them and we go to trial within 60 days. Those are your only options." Richard sat at the dining room table, the same table where he'd declared that parasites get no food, reading through the contract with shaking hands. I watched decades of control and authority drain from his face as he understood his complete lack of power in this moment. His hands trembled as he picked up the pen. Richard signed the contract with a shaking hand, and I watched 3 years of supervised transformation begin. I didn't expect miracles. I didn't expect sudden enlightenment or dramatic redemption. What I witnessed through Elaine's monthly reports and occasional direct observations was something more mundane and perhaps more genuine, the slow, unglamorous work of people learning to live differently. The contract required Richard to engage in productive employment, and Elaine reported that he'd taken a part-time position at Morrison's Hardware, a local store he'd shopped at for decades, but never imagined working in. The job paid $15 an hour and required him to help customers find supplies, stock shelves, and process transactions. For a man who'd spent his adult life hiring others to do manual labor, the work was both physically exhausting and psychologically crushing. He came home the first week barely able to stand, Elaine wrote in her first monthly report. His feet hurt, his back ached, and I could see him wrestling with the humiliation of wearing a name tag and being told what to do by a store manager half his age. But something unexpected happened in the second month. A customer came in looking for specific plumbing supplies, and Richard, who'd done enough home repairs over the years to know his way around a hardware store, was able to help. The customer thanked him genuinely, and Richard experienced something he hadn't felt in a long time, the satisfaction of being useful without strings attached. Elaine's reports documented small shifts. A young coworker asked him how to handle a difficult customer, and Richard showed him patience I didn't know he was capable of. He's starting to understand that there's dignity in all work, that the people he used to look down on are simply doing what needs to be done. The most telling incident came in month 3. A customer, someone from Richard's former social circle, came into the store and didn't recognize him at first. When recognition dawned, the man treated Richard with casual dismissiveness, the exact tone Richard had used with service workers his entire life. Elaine told me Richard came home that evening and said, "Now I know how it feels." Madeline's transformation was harder to track because she'd cut contact with everyone except Elaine. Without financial support from Richard or any expectation of help from me, she'd been forced to rebuild her life completely. Elaine's reports mentioned that Madeline had taken a job at a retail clothing store, moved to a small one-bedroom apartment, and was learning to budget for the first time at age 38. "She called me crying last week because she couldn't afford both groceries and her phone bill," Elaine wrote. I told her she'd have to choose. That's new for her, having to choose, having to prioritize, having to understand that money isn't infinite. But by month 4, Elaine reported something different. Madeline got promoted to assistant manager. She's good at this work, patient with customers, organized with inventory. She seems surprised by her own competence, like she's discovering she's capable of things she never tried because everything was always handed to her. Most significantly, Madeline had started therapy. Not the expensive practice that Richard would have paid for, but a sliding-scale counseling center that worked with her limited income. She's learning about the childhood manipulation, Elaine wrote, understanding that Richard controlled her through praise the same way he controlled Pauline through criticism. Different methods, same goal, keeping both daughters dependent and manageable. I read these reports at my desk each month, feeling complicated things. I wasn't ready to reconcile with either of them, wasn't ready to open doors I'd closed for good reasons. But I could acknowledge that they were trying in their imperfect ways to become people who could stand without stealing someone else's foundation. Elaine herself became the unexpected anchor of this fractured family system. She managed the household finances with the skills she'd learned from bookkeeping work, made sure Richard attended his mandatory therapy appointments, and worked part-time to contribute to household expenses. Her monthly reports were professional and factual, but she occasionally added personal notes that I suspected she included deliberately. Richard cried after work today. A customer thanked him for his help and said he was a lifesaver. I think it was the first genuine appreciation he's received in months, and it broke something in him. He's starting to understand the difference between respect that's demanded and respect that's earned. Another note. Madeline saved enough money to buy herself a used car, nothing fancy, but she earned it herself. She called to tell me about it, and I could hear pride in her voice. Real pride, not the performance she used to give Richard. I appreciated Elaine's documentation, not because I needed proof of their suffering, but because I needed to know the contract was working. That they were actually changing, not just waiting for the 3 years to pass, so they could return to old patterns. 6 months into the contract, Elaine called me with something different in her voice. Not the measured professionalism of her reports, but genuine surprise tinged with confusion. Pauline, I found something in the attic. I was looking for old tax documents. We need them for Richard's financial counseling, and I came across a storage box I'd never seen before. It was hidden behind holiday decorations, deliberately tucked away. The box is labeled Pauline in Richard's handwriting. My stomach tightened. What's in it? I haven't opened it, Elaine said. It felt like something you should be present for. But Pauline, the box is old. Some of the tape is yellowed. Whatever's inside, he's been keeping it for years. I thought about all the things my father had stolen from me. Money, recognition, my mother's final message. What else could there possibly be? What had he hidden away that carried my name stored in darkness while he systematically diminished me in the light? I'll come by tomorrow, I told her. I arrived at the house the next afternoon, bringing David with me as a witness to whatever we were about to discover. Elaine met us at the door, her face drawn with an emotion I couldn't quite identify, something between grief and revelation. The box sat on the kitchen table exactly as she'd described, old cardboard, yellowed packing tape, my name written in my father's angular handwriting across the top. It looked like it had been sealed for years, then reopened and resealed multiple times, as if he'd returned to it periodically, but never quite had the courage to throw it away. I haven't opened it since I found it, Elaine said. That felt like your decision. I sat down and carefully peeled back the tape. The box opened with the musty smell of things kept too long in darkness. On top were my elementary school honor roll certificates, all of them from 3rd grade through 8th. I'd assumed they'd been thrown away years ago, that they'd meant nothing to anyone. Beneath those was a business plan I'd written at 16 for a class project, a detailed proposal for a property management company that had earned me an A and a teacher's comment. Pauline has remarkable financial acumen for her age. There were newspaper clippings, a small mention in the local paper when I'd closed my first significant real estate deal at 29, an article from a business journal about emerging entrepreneurs that featured a paragraph about Boyd Holdings, A photo from a charity event where I'd been honored for community investment. He'd saved them all, cut them out, carefully stored them like treasures. At the bottom of the box were photos I didn't remember being taken. Me at my college graduation walking across the stage. My father had claimed he couldn't attend due to work, but here was proof he'd been there sitting somewhere in the audience, camera in hand, documenting a moment he'd told me wasn't important enough to make time for. But the most devastating item was a leather-bound journal well worn with dates spanning 2012 to 2019. I recognized it as the type therapists sometimes recommend for processing difficult emotions. I opened to a random page and saw my father's handwriting less controlled than his usual careful script, as if written in moments of emotional intensity. March 15, 2016. Watched Pauline give a presentation at her company today. Found the address online and sat in the back of the conference room where she wouldn't see me. She was brilliant, confident, knowledgeable, commanding the room in ways I never could. I wanted to go up to her afterward and tell her I was proud. But I couldn't, because telling her that would mean admitting I was wrong about everything I've ever said about her, and I don't know how to do that without losing what little authority I have left. I flipped to another entry, hands trembling. July 8, 2017. Pauline called today. No specific reason, just checking in to see how I was doing. I was cruel to her, made comments about how she only calls when she needs something, even though she wasn't asking for anything. The truth is, I'm terrified. Every time she calls not needing anything, I'm reminded that she's complete without me. That she's built a life where I'm optional. And someday she'll realize that, and I'll be alone like my parents left me alone, and I don't know how to survive that. I read entry after entry, each one revealing a truth I'd never imagined my father was proud of me. He'd been proud all along, but that pride was so tangled with fear and trauma and his own unhealed wounds that it came out as cruelty, as sabotage, as a desperate need to keep me small so I'd continue needing him. Then I found the entry from Christmas Eve, written just hours before the dinner that had changed everything. December 24th, 2024. I'm going to lose her tonight. I can feel it. She's been pulling away for months, visiting less, responding to my calls, less quickly building a life that doesn't include me. I don't know how to ask her to stay without begging, and I can't beg because then I'm 25 again, standing in my parents' dining room being told I'm worthless. So I'll do what I know how to do. I'll make her feel like she needs me by reminding her she's worthless without me. I'll humiliate her in front of people so she remembers her place. It's the only way I know to keep her close. I hate myself for it, but I'm more afraid of losing her than I am of hating myself. I closed the journal, unable to read more. The room was silent except for my uneven breathing. He knew. I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew it was wrong, and he did it anyway. Elaine nodded, tears streaming down her face. I brought this to Richard before calling you. I needed to see how he'd respond. I needed to know if confronting him with his own words would break through the defensiveness, or if he'd just find a way to justify it. And? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. He broke down completely, started sobbing in a way I've never seen from him. He kept saying the same thing over and over. I destroyed the only person who ever really loved me. And I knew I was doing it. I sat there holding the journal, and I understood something that made everything harder, not easier. My father had loved me. Not well, not healthily, not in any way that should be celebrated. But he'd loved me. And that love, poisoned by his trauma and fear, had manifested as the systematic destruction of the person he claimed to cherish. Knowing this didn't change what he'd done. It didn't excuse decades of cruelty. But it answered the question I'd carried since childhood. Was I worth loving? The answer was yes. I'd always been worth loving. But I'd been loved by someone who didn't know how to love without destroying. I spent 2 days processing what I'd found in that box before Elaine called again. This time her voice carried genuine fear. Pauline Richard collapsed at the hardware store. He's at Mercy Hospital. They're saying it's a heart attack, mild but still serious. He's stable now, but they're keeping him for observation. She paused. I'm not asking you to come. I just thought you should know. I sat with that information for several hours. Part of me wanted to feel satisfaction the man who'd terrorized me was now experiencing his own vulnerability, his own powerlessness. But when I examined my feelings honestly, I found only emptiness. No triumph, no vindication, just a tired hollowness that came from decades of hoping for something that was never going to arrive the way I'd imagined. I drove to the hospital the next morning, not for reconciliation, but for closure. I needed to see him one more time to understand if anything in that diary was real or if even his private confessions were somehow performative. The cardiac unit was quiet, sanitized, filled with the steady beeping of monitors. Richard's room was at the end of the hall. Through the window I could see him lying in the hospital bed looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. The man who'd wielded power through intimidation was now connected to IV lines and heart monitors, dependent on nurses and doctors completely stripped of the authority he'd spent his life defending. Elaine sat in the chair beside his bed. When she saw me in the doorway, she stood and stepped outside. He's been asking for you, she said quietly. I told him I didn't know if you'd come. Is he going to survive this? The doctors say yes. It was mild a warning more than anything catastrophic. But between the physical stress of work and the emotional weight of everything he's been processing, his body gave him a message he can't ignore anymore. I looked through the window at my father. He was awake, but staring at the ceiling, his expression vacant. I wondered what he was thinking about, whether he was processing mortality or just trying to figure out his next move. Before you go in, Elaine said, reaching into her bag. I brought this. It was the box from the attic, the one containing my father's diary. I think you should have it. Not to excuse anything, but so you know the whole truth before you make any final decisions about whether to have him in your life. I took the box, though I'd already read most of the journal. Still, Elaine was right. I needed to sit with it longer to fully understand what it meant that my father had been proud of me while simultaneously destroying me. I spent an hour in the hospital cafeteria reading entries I'd skimmed the first time, forcing myself to absorb the full weight of his conflicted feelings. The pride that coexisted with sabotage, the love that manifested as cruelty, the fear that drove every terrible choice. Learning he'd been proud of me didn't erase the damage. If anything, it made everything worse. He'd known I was extraordinary, had documented my achievements like precious artifacts, and had hurt me anyway. The cruelty wasn't born from ignorance. It was born from knowledge he couldn't bear to acknowledge publicly because it threatened his fragile sense of self. When I finally returned to his room, Elaine stepped out to give us privacy. Richard turned his head toward me, his eyes watery, his face gray against the white hospital sheets. He tried to speak but couldn't seem to find words. I sat in the visitor's chair, not close but present, and looked at him with all the clarity that months of distance had given me. I read your diary, I said. All of it. The entries about watching me from the back of rooms, the ones about being proud of me, the one from Christmas Eve where you admitted you planned the whole humiliation deliberately. He closed his eyes, and I saw shame cross his face. I need to ask you something. I continued, my voice steady. And I need you to answer honestly because this is probably the last real conversation we'll ever have. He nodded barely. If you loved me, if you were proud of me like those entries say, then why? Why did you need me to feel worthless? The silence stretched so long I thought he might refuse to answer. Then, in a voice rough from medication and emotion, he spoke. Because every time I looked at you succeeding, being strong, building a life without needing me, I saw everything I was terrified to be. Independent, unafraid, free. He paused, struggling with the words. And I couldn't let you be those things because it reminded me I wasn't. You were everything I wanted to be and couldn't figure out how to become, so I tried to make you small enough that I could feel big. The honesty of it was devastating, not because it excused anything, but because it confirmed what I'd suspected. I'd been punished for being exactly who I was supposed to be. I'm sorry, Pauline. His voice cracked. I'm sorry for all of it. For stealing from you, for humiliating you, for making you question your worth when you've always been extraordinary. I'm sorry for being too broken to love you the way you deserved. But sorry doesn't fix what I broke. I know that. I sat there absorbing his apology, the first real one I'd ever heard from him. It didn't heal anything, didn't erase decades of damage, didn't make me suddenly willing to rebuild a relationship that had been toxic from the beginning. But it was true. For the first time in my life, my father had said something completely, devastatingly true. I stood to leave, gathering my coat and the box containing his diary. As I reached the door, I paused without turning around. Sorry doesn't fix it, I said quietly. But it's the first true thing you've ever said to me. I'll think about what that means. As I walked down the hospital corridor toward the elevator, I heard Elaine return to the room. Through the closing door, I caught Richard's whispered question, "Will she ever forgive me?" And Elaine's response, gentle but firm, "That's not the question. The question is whether you can forgive yourself." A week after Richard was released from the hospital, I called a meeting at the house. David accompanied me, briefcase in hand, ready to draft whatever legal documents the afternoon required. Richard was moving slowly, still recovering, but he was present. Elaine sat beside him, her hand resting protectively on his arm. The dining room table site of so many painful memories was about to become the place where I'd make a decision that would define not just their future, but who I wanted to be. I'd spent the week considering my options with the methodical approach I brought to all major business decisions. I could continue the 3-year contract as written, maintaining the structure and accountability measures. I could evict them immediately. The forgery attempt gave me legal grounds, and Richard's health crisis didn't erase his criminal behavior. I could sell the house and give them a portion to start over somewhere smaller. I could even gift the property back unconditionally, though that option felt like enabling rather than healing. David had advised option 1 or 2, maintain control or cut ties cleanly. "You've established boundaries," he'd said. "Don't blur them now out of guilt or sympathy." But I wasn't thinking about this decision from a purely legal standpoint anymore. I was thinking about legacy, about what kind of person I wanted to be when this chapter finally closed, about whether justice and mercy could coexist, or whether choosing one always meant abandoning the other. "I've made a decision about the house," I began, my voice steady. "I'm converting the property to a life estate." I watched Richard's face, trying to gauge his understanding. Elaine looked confused, so I explained. "You and Elaine can live here for the remainder of your lives rent-free without fear of eviction. The house is yours to occupy but not to own. You can never sell it, can never borrow against it, can never use it as collateral for anything. You're responsible for basic maintenance and upkeep, but the property will never be at risk of being taken from you." Richard's eyes filled with tears. "Pauline," I held up my hand, "I'm not finished. Upon your deaths, the house transfers to the Pauline Boyd Foundation for Family Justice, a nonprofit I'm establishing to help older women escape financial abuse and family exploitation. The house where I was called a parasite will become a resource for women learning to protect themselves. The dining room where I sat before an empty plate will serve meals to women rebuilding their lives." The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. I was transforming the site of my humiliation into something that could prevent others from experiencing the same pain. The house would have a legacy beyond Richard's cruelty. It would become part of something larger, something that mattered. "This solution gives you security." I continued, looking directly at my father. "But it also ensures you can never exploit this asset again. You can live here safely, but you can't use it to hurt anyone else. And when you're gone, it will do good in the world. That feels right to me." David was already pulling out documents, ready to draft the life estate agreement. Elaine was crying quietly, whether from relief or grief I couldn't tell. Richard looked like he was trying to process the magnitude of what I'd just offered. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but something more complex, a chance to live out his days without fear, combined with assurance that his worst impulses would be constrained. Then Richard cleared his throat, his voice still weak from the hospital stay. "There's something I want to add, if you'll allow it." I waited, curious but cautious. "I'd like my name on one thing, a plaque by the front door." He took a shaky breath. "It should say, 'This house belonged to Richard Boyd, who called his daughter a parasite and learned too late what she was worth. May those who enter here do better.'" The room went completely silent. I stared at my father, trying to understand what he was asking for. Not exoneration, not even really redemption. He was asking to be permanently remembered for his worst act, to have his failure enshrined where everyone who entered the house would see it, to ensure he could never rewrite history, never cast himself as the victim, never convince himself or anyone else that he hadn't done exactly what he did. For women my age and older women who'd watched abusive parents rewrite their own histories, claim they'd been misunderstood, insist they'd been good parents who'd done their best. This was extraordinary. An abuser choosing to be accountable not just privately, but permanently publicly. "Why?" I asked. "Because I don't want to forget," Richard said quietly. "And I don't want anyone who comes after me to forget either. If this house is going to help women like you, women I hurt, then they should know whose house it was. They should know that the person who owned it was capable of cruelty, and that cruelty has consequences that outlive the person who inflicts it." I looked at Elaine, who nodded slightly, as surprised as I was. I looked at David, who raised his eyebrows but said nothing. "All right," I said finally. "The plaque will be made." David began drafting the life estate documents, the scratch of his pen filling the quiet room. This was happening. After months of confrontation and revelation, of stolen inheritances exposed and forgeries discovered, of public shame and private reckoning, we were creating something that felt like resolution, if not quite healing. As David finalized the language and prepared signature pages, I heard the front door open. Footsteps in the hallway. Then Madeline appeared in the dining room doorway, looking thinner than I remembered her, clothes simpler, her face bare of the makeup she used to wear like armor. "I heard you were all here," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I have something to say to both of you, and I need you to hear me all the way through." A week after Richard was released from the hospital, I called a meeting at the house. David accompanied me, briefcase in hand, ready to draft whatever legal documents the afternoon required. Richard was moving slowly, still recovering, but he was present. Elaine sat beside him, her hand resting protectively on his arm. The dining room table, site of so many painful memories, was about to become the place where I'd make a decision that would define not just their future, but who I wanted to be. I'd spent the week considering my options with the methodical approach I brought to all major business decisions. I could continue the 3-year contract as written, maintaining the structure and accountability measures. I could evict them immediately. The forgery attempt gave me legal grounds, and Richard's health crisis didn't erase his criminal behavior. I could sell the house and give them a portion to start over somewhere smaller. I could even gift the property back unconditionally, though that option felt like enabling rather than healing. David had advised option 1 or 2, maintain control or cut ties cleanly. "You've established boundaries," he'd said. "Don't blur them now out of guilt or sympathy." But I wasn't thinking about this decision from a purely legal standpoint anymore. I was thinking about legacy, about what kind of person I wanted to be when this chapter finally closed, about whether justice and mercy could coexist, or whether choosing one always meant abandoning the other. "I've made a decision about the house." I began, my voice steady. "I'm converting the property to a life estate." I watched Richard's face, trying to gauge his understanding. Elaine looked confused, so I explained. "You and Elaine can live here for the remainder of your lives rent-free without fear of eviction. The house is yours to occupy, but not to own. You can never sell it, can never borrow against it, can never use it as collateral for anything. You're responsible for basic maintenance and upkeep, but the property will never be at risk of being taken from you." Richard's eyes filled with tears. "Pauline." I held up my hand. "I'm not finished." Upon your deaths, the house transfers to the Pauline Boyd Foundation for Family Justice, a nonprofit I'm establishing to help older women escape financial abuse and family exploitation. The house where I was called a parasite will become a resource for women learning to protect themselves. The dining room where I sat before an empty plate will serve meals to women rebuilding their lives. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. I was transforming the site of my humiliation into something that could prevent others from experiencing the same pain. The house would have a legacy beyond Richard's cruelty. It would become part of something larger, something that mattered. This solution gives you security, I continued, looking directly at my father. But it also ensures you can never exploit this asset again. You can live here safely, but you can't use it to hurt anyone else. And when you're gone, it will do good in the world. That feels right to me. David was already pulling out documents ready to draft the life estate agreement. Elaine was crying quietly, whether from relief or grief, I couldn't tell. Richard looked like he was trying to process the magnitude of what I'd just offered, not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but something more complex, a chance to live out his days without fear combined with assurance that his worst impulses would be constrained. Then Richard cleared his throat, his voice still weak from the hospital stay. There's something I want to add, if you'll allow it. I waited, curious but cautious. I'd like my name on one thing, a plaque by the front door. He took a shaky breath. It should say this house belonged to Richard Boyd, who called his daughter a parasite and learned too late what she was worth. May those who enter here do better. The room went completely silent. I stared at my father, trying to understand what he was asking for. Not exoneration, not even really redemption. He was asking to be permanently remembered for his worst act. To have his failure enshrined where everyone who entered the house would see it. To ensure he could never rewrite history, never cast himself as the victim, never convince himself or anyone else that he hadn't done exactly what he did. For women my age and older women who'd watched abusive parents rewrite their own histories, claim they'd been misunderstood, insist they'd been good parents who'd done their best. This was extraordinary. An abuser choosing to be accountable not just privately, but permanently, publicly. Why? I asked. Because I don't want to forget, Richard said quietly. And I don't want anyone who comes after me to forget either. If this house is going to help women like you women I hurt, then they should know whose house it was. They should know that the person who owned it was capable of cruelty, and that cruelty has consequences that outlive the person who inflicts it. I looked at Elaine, who nodded slightly, as surprised as I was. I looked at David, who raised his eyebrows but said nothing. All right, I said finally. The plaque will be made. David began drafting the life estate documents, the scratch of his pen filling the quiet room. This was happening. After months of confrontation and revelation of stolen inheritances exposed and forgeries discovered, of public shame and private reckoning, we were creating something that felt like resolution, if not quite healing. As David finalized the language and prepared signature pages, I heard the front door open, footsteps in the hallway. Then Madeline appeared in the dining room doorway, looking thinner than I remembered, her clothes simpler, her face bare of the makeup she used to wear like armor. I heard you were all here, she said, her voice shaking slightly. I have something to say to both of you, and I need you to hear me all the way through. Madeline stood in the dining room doorway, and I could see she'd changed in the months since I'd last seen her. She was thinner, dressed in jeans and a plain sweater that looked nothing like the designer clothes she used to favor. Her face was bare of makeup, her hair pulled back simply. She looked like someone who'd been stripped down to essentials and was learning to live without armor. Come in, I said, gesturing to the empty chair at the table. She sat, but didn't look at me directly. Instead, she stared at her hands folded on the table, gathering courage. When she finally spoke, her voice shook but didn't break. I need to apologize to you, Pauline. A real apology, not the kind I've given before where I make excuses or blame circumstances. I've been in therapy for 6 months now, and I'm starting to understand what I did, what I participated in, and I need you to know that I see it. I said nothing, waiting. I benefited from stolen money. Your money. Mom's money that was meant for you. I drove a car bought with your inheritance, took trips funded by theft, wore clothes purchased with resources that should have been yours. And I never questioned it. I never asked where the money came from. I just accepted it as my due because Dad told me I deserved it, and that was easier than thinking critically about the family dynamics. She took a shaky breath. I stayed silent when he humiliated you. Not just at Christmas, but dozens of times over the years. Every time he introduced you as the other daughter or dismissed your achievements or made jokes about you being the family burden, I said nothing. I laughed sometimes. I participated in the narrative that you were less than me, that you were difficult and ungrateful because believing that made me feel special. I watched her struggle through this, and I could see it wasn't performative. This was genuinely difficult for her. I know what you're going to say, that I was manipulated as a child, that Dad controlled me through praise the same way he controlled you through criticism. And that's true. My therapist has helped me understand that I was being used, that Dad pitted us against each other deliberately. But I'm not blaming my childhood for my adult choices. I was controlled as a kid, but I chose to remain willfully blind as an adult because it was comfortable. Because questioning the system would have meant giving up my position as the favored daughter, and I wasn't brave enough to do that. She finally looked up at me, and I saw tears in her eyes, but also something else, genuine shame, not the performative kind that seeks sympathy. I was jealous of you, she admitted, of your actual competence, your real strength, the way you built something from nothing while I was handed everything, and built nothing. And that jealousy made me complicit in Dad's cruelty. Because if he was right about you being less than, then maybe I was actually more than. But I wasn't. I was just the daughter he chose to spoil instead of starve, and I let that convince me I was special. The silence after she finished speaking felt heavy. Richard sat frozen at the table, Elaine dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, and David continued taking notes as if documenting a legal proceeding. I'm not apologizing to get something from you, Madeline continued. I'm not asking for forgiveness or reconciliation, or even a relationship. I'm apologizing because you deserved to hear this 10 years ago and I was too cowardly to say it. You deserved a sister who would stand up for you, and instead you got someone who participated in your erasure. I'm sorry. I let her words settle. This was the apology I'd never expected to receive, not because it fixed anything, but because it was real. It acknowledged specifics, took responsibility without deflection, and didn't ask me to make her feel better about her guilt. Thank you for saying that, I replied, my voice carefully neutral. Madeline nodded as if preparing to leave, but then she pulled a folder from her bag. There's one more thing. I have a request, and I'll understand completely if you say no. She slid the folder across the table. Inside were certificates from online nonprofit management courses, volunteer reference letters from a domestic violence shelter, and a formal job application, the kind with salary expectations and references and a cover letter. I want to work for the Pauline Boyd Foundation, she said. Not as a favor, not because we're sisters. I'm asking to interview for an entry-level position earning minimum wage to start with no special treatment. I've spent the last 6 months getting certified in nonprofit management, volunteering at a shelter to learn about the work and building skills that might be useful. I want to spend my life helping women escape family situations like the one I helped perpetuate. The request was so unexpected that I didn't respond immediately. Madeline rushed to fill the silence. I know I don't deserve your trust. I know I'd be starting with massive disadvantages. But I'm asking for the chance to prove that change is real, that I can become someone useful, instead of someone who just takes up space. If you say no, I'll understand, but I had to ask. I looked at my sister, truly looked at her, and saw someone who'd been dismantled and was trying to build herself into something better. It would be easy to say no, to keep that door closed, to never risk being disappointed by her again. But I thought about the person I wanted to be, about whether my foundation's mission included giving people chances to change or just helping their victims. You can interview for an open position in 6 months, I said finally. Not with me, with our hiring committee. You'll be evaluated like any other candidate based on your qualifications and fit for the role. If you're hired, you'll answer to your direct supervisor, not me. You'll be held to the same standards as everyone else. If you prove competent and trustworthy over a year, we'll talk about increasing responsibility." I paused, making sure she understood. "I'm not giving you a career, Madeline. I'm giving you the opportunity to earn one. That's all." She nodded, and I saw something like relief cross her face. "That's more than I deserve. Thank you." We didn't hug. We didn't cry together or have a moment of sisterly reconciliation. We simply shook hands across the table, formal, professional, honest. It wasn't healing, but it was the possibility of something new. As she left, I felt an unexpected weight settle in my chest. Grief for the sisterhood we never had mixed with something that might eventually become hope. 3 months later, my phone rang with a New York area code I didn't recognize. "Ms. Boyd, my name is Jennifer Chen, and I'm a senior producer with National Perspectives. We're a documentary-style news program focused on social justice issues, and we'd like to feature your story." I listened as she explained that my podcast interview had reached their team through viewer recommendations. Hundreds of women had written to the program asking them to cover the invisible daughter story more deeply. They wanted to understand how I'd found the courage to set boundaries after a lifetime of abuse, how I'd built a business while being systematically diminished, and what advice I had for others in similar situations. "I understand this is sensitive," Jennifer continued. "Your first interview protected your family's identity. Going national would make it much harder to maintain that anonymity. I want you to understand what you'd be walking into." She was right. My father's health was still fragile. The community already knew who we were, but national exposure meant millions of people would be able to identify us. It could re-traumatize everyone involved, including me. But then Jennifer said something that made me pause. "I want to share something with you. We've received letters from women who say your first interview literally saved their lives. One woman left her abusive family after 40 years because hearing your story gave her permission. Another finally pressed charges against a relative who'd been stealing from her for decades. These women are asking for more, not sensationalism, but depth. They want to understand how to protect themselves." I spent 3 days deciding. I talked to David about legal implications, to my therapist about emotional readiness, and to Elaine about how this might affect Richard. In the end, the question came down to, did protecting my father's privacy matter more than potentially helping thousands of women who were living variations of my story? I called Jennifer back. "I'll do it with conditions. I'll use first names only. I won't give identifying details about our community, but I'll tell the whole truth, the stolen inheritance, the forgery, the life estate solution. I'll talk about the complexity of loving someone who hurt you, and the reality that sometimes protection means distance, not reconciliation." The interview took place in my office, just Jennifer and a small camera crew. We talked for 3 hours. I told stories I'd never shared publicly, the Christmas dinners where I was systematically erased, the times I gave money for emergencies that turned out to be lies the moment I discovered my mother had tried to protect me, and my father had stolen that protection. I talked about the diary, about learning that cruelty and love had coexisted in my father's heart, and how that knowledge made everything more complicated, not simpler. "What would you say to women watching this who recognize their own families in your story?" Jennifer asked near the end. I thought carefully before answering. "I'd say that you're not crazy for feeling hurt by people who claim to love you. That financial abuse is real even when it comes from family. That setting boundaries isn't vindictive, it's survival. And that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in a dynamic that destroys you." The episode aired on a Tuesday evening. Within 48 hours, it had been viewed 12 million times across various platforms. My phone became unusable from the volume of messages. The foundation's donation page crashed from traffic, and when our web team got it back online, we discovered $300,000 in unsolicited contributions. But the most overwhelming response came in the form of emails. 1,847 women wrote to share their own stories. Women who'd been called parasites by parents they'd supported financially. Women who'd discovered stolen inheritances. Women who'd finally gone no contact with families that drained them. Women who were pressing charges they'd been too scared to file before. One email said, "I'm 62 years old. I've given my mother half my income for 40 years while she told everyone I was selfish. Your interview gave me permission to say no. Yesterday, I changed my bank accounts. Thank you for showing me I wasn't alone." Another, "My brother stole my share of Dad's estate and the family sided with him. I thought I was crazy for being hurt. Your story validated everything I felt. I've hired a lawyer." The emotional weight of knowing my pain had helped others was almost unbearable. I'd shared my story expecting judgment or accusations of vindictiveness. Instead, I'd found thousands of women who'd been waiting for permission to protect themselves. Then, something unexpected happened. 3 women from Richard's community contacted Jennifer's team, offering to speak on record using their real names. They'd seen the national broadcast and wanted to add their voices to mine. Mrs. Chen was the first. "I've known the Boyd family for 30 years. Pauline paid my mortgage for 6 months when I had cancer over $8,000. When I said I'd pay her back, she told me to pay it forward when I could." Meanwhile, her father told everyone at church she was a freeloader who'd never made anything of herself. People should know who she really is. 2 other neighbors shared similar stories. Pauline funding college scholarships, Pauline helping with medical bills, Pauline quietly keeping families in their homes during crises. Their testimonials added a dimension I hadn't provided myself: community verification that contradicted every lie my father had told about me. The night the follow-up piece with the neighbor interviews aired, Elaine called me. "Richard watched it," she said quietly. "I was bracing for rage or denial or him claiming you'd manipulated everyone. But he didn't say any of that." "What did he say?" He turned to me with tears running down his face and said, "She's right about all of it, and people should know." I hung up with Elaine, feeling destabilized. My father saying, "She's right about all of it," felt like crossing some threshold I hadn't expected to reach. But I also knew that private acknowledgement to Elaine was different from accountability that cost him something real. A week later, Jennifer called me. "Pauline, I need to tell you about something we've received. Your father wrote us a letter, a long one. He's asking us to publish it." My stomach dropped. "What kind of letter?" "An apology, a confession. Full public accountability using his real name. We want your permission before we publish it." She read portions over the phone. Richard had identified himself as Richard Boyd of Maple Street, confirming every detail I'd shared. He described his behavior as financial abuse, emotional cruelty, and the cowardice of a man who couldn't face his own trauma, so he inflicted it on his daughter. He explained his history with his parents, but explicitly stated, "Trauma explains, but doesn't justify." I understood exactly what I was doing to Pauline, and I did it anyway because hurting her made me feel powerful. The letter ended with, "My daughter gave me mercy I didn't deserve. I'm writing this so other parents who recognize themselves in my story might choose differently before they lose their children forever. If you see yourself in my behavior, stop. Get help. Apologize while there's still time. Don't wait until you've destroyed the person you're supposed to protect." "What do you think?" Jennifer asked. "Do we publish it?" I sat with the question for a long moment. Part of me wanted to say no to protect him from further public exposure to keep this private. But another part recognized that this was his choice. His accountability and preventing him from taking it would be its own form of control. "Publish it," I said. "But make sure it's clear this is his statement, not mine. I'm not endorsing or condemning it. It's his to own." The letter went live on the program's website 2 days later. The response was immediate and divided. Some people in Richard's community saw it as genuine accountability, a remarkable act of humility from a man who'd spent his life protecting his ego. Church members who'd avoided him for months reached out cautiously, acknowledging the courage it took to be so publicly vulnerable. Others viewed it more cynically. I heard through Elaine that some neighbors thought it was self-serving an attempt to rehabilitate his image or garner sympathy. They pointed out that public confession was easier than private repair, that he was performing accountability rather than actually changing. Both interpretations had merit. The truth was probably somewhere in between: a man who genuinely recognized his failures, but who was also trying to find a way to live with himself to reshape his legacy before it was too late. What struck me most was how rare the letter was. How many abusive parents ever publicly admit wrongdoing without qualification? How many take full responsibility without deflecting blame onto their children or circumstances? For audiences my age and older women who'd spent decades waiting for apologies that never came, Richard's letter represented something they'd never experienced. It was imperfect, possibly incomplete, but it was more than most ever received. The letter also created unexpected ripples. Elaine told me that 3 men from the community had privately reached out to Richard, saying they'd recognized their own behavior in his story. They asked if he'd meet with them, share how he was trying to change, offer guidance on repairing relationships with their own estranged children. My father somehow had become an accidental mentor in accountability. Within days, reporters started calling me for comment. They wanted to know if I forgave him, if we'd reconciled, if his public apology changed our relationship. I gave the same careful response to all of them. I appreciate that my father has taken public accountability. That took courage. I paused, choosing my words carefully. But I want to be clear about something: this doesn't erase harm, and it doesn't mean our relationship is repaired. Public apology is a first step, not a destination. The real question is whether someone's actions change long-term, and that takes years to evaluate, not weeks. I refused every invitation to appear on camera, with Richard declined every request for a joint interview or public reconciliation. I have boundaries that protect my well-being, I told one persistent reporter. Acknowledging my father's growth doesn't obligate me to rebuild a relationship with him. Those are separate things, and I'm allowed to choose differently than the narrative people might prefer. That distinction felt crucial. For women my age who'd been pressured their whole lives to forgive, to reconcile, to prioritize family harmony over personal protection, I wanted them to see that you could acknowledge someone's change without giving them access to hurt you again. That boundaries and compassion could coexist. That you didn't owe anyone reconciliation just because they finally apologized. The weeks following Richard's letter were strange. My foundation's work continued to grow. The national attention brought resources and visibility that allowed us to expand faster than I'd planned. We were helping women I'd never meet in situations I'd never directly witness, and somehow my private pain had become part of a larger conversation about family abuse and the courage it takes to choose yourself. 6 months after the national interview on a date I would have let pass unmarked if Elaine hadn't mentioned it, I received a package at my office. The return address was unfamiliar, a law firm I didn't recognize in a city 2 states away. Inside was a letter explaining that the package had been held in trust to be delivered to me on the occasion of Eleanor Marie Boyd's 70th birthday or upon the resolution of certain family matters, whichever came first. My mother's 70th birthday. She would have been 70 years old today. Beneath the letter was something I thought had been lost forever. 23 envelopes lay before me on my desk, each one bearing my mother's handwriting. They were organized chronologically, sealed with care, marked with the age I would have been when she intended me to read them. The earliest said, Pauline, age 1, in her graceful script. The last said, Pauline, age 23. The accompanying letter from the law firm explained that my mother had established this arrangement through her sister Margaret, the aunt I'd never known existed. The letters had been held in trust with instructions. Deliver them when Pauline turns 43 or upon resolution of family financial matters, whichever comes first. The law firm had been monitoring from a distance, and my national interview had triggered their action. I called my assistant and cleared my schedule for the rest of the day. Then I locked my office door, made tea I wouldn't drink, and opened the first letter. My dearest Pauline, you're 1 year old today, barely walking already, so serious about everything. You study the world like you're trying to understand its rules before you'll agree to participate. Your father finds this unsettling. He wants you to be easier, lighter, more like other babies. But I see your careful observation as strength. You're learning. You're preparing. Never let anyone make you feel that thoughtfulness is a flaw. Love, Mom. I opened the next envelope with shaking hands. Age 8. You're so serious and kind. Dad doesn't understand you because you remind him of me, independent and thoughtful. He sees that independence as rejection of him, when really it's just who you are. Don't let his discomfort make you doubt yourself. You're not too serious. You're not too quiet. You're exactly who you're meant to be. I read through my childhood in my mother's words, and with each letter a narrative I'd internalized began to crack. I wasn't too much or too little. I wasn't the problem child who required fixing. I was simply myself, and my mother had seen that valued. It tried to protect it, even knowing she might not be there to defend it in person. Age 16. I see you protecting Madeline from Dad's moods. You step between them, absorb his frustration, redirect his attention. That's noble, sweetheart, but I need you to hear this. You're not her mother. I am. It's my job to protect you both, and if I fail at that, it's my failure, not yours. If I'm gone and you're reading this, please remember, protect yourself first. You can't save everyone, and trying will break you. The warning hit me hard. My mother had seen the pattern forming even then, me making myself small, me absorbing blows meant for others, me taking responsibility for family dynamics I didn't create. Age 23. Written just weeks before she died. By now you know about the trust fund. If something happened and Dad didn't give it to you, find Margaret. She'll help you get what's yours. But Pauline, the money matters less than this. You were never invisible to me. I saw every kindness you showed when no one was watching. Every time you helped a neighbor, every time you sacrificed for Madeline, every achievement you earned through pure determination. I saw all of it. I'm so proud of you, and I'm sorry I won't be there to tell you in person as often as you deserve to hear it. I had to stop reading. The grief was overwhelming, not just for losing her, but for all the years I'd believed I was forgettable, dismissible, fundamentally less worthy of attention. My mother had seen me, she'd valued me, and my father had spent 20 years systematically erasing that truth. When I could breathe again, I opened more letters. Each one seemed designed to counter specific damage my mother must have anticipated. At age 30, she'd written, "If you're reading this and you've had to fight for your place in the family good, you're learning you deserve better than what they're offering. Don't settle for people who make you small, even if those people are family, especially if those people are family. You were born to be extraordinary, and I'll be cheering for you from wherever I am." At age 40, I hope by now you've built a life that reflects your values, not their expectations. I hope you've surrounded yourself with people who see you clearly. And if you haven't, if you're still trying to earn love from people who can't give it, please stop. Please choose yourself. It's not selfish. It's survival. By the time I reached the final letter, tears had soaked through the first pages I'd read. My mother hadn't just loved me. She'd understood exactly what I'd face after she was gone, and she'd tried to arm me with the truth I'd need to survive it. The last letter meant for age 23, but reaching me at 43 ended with, "You are not what they say you are. You never were. Trust yourself, protect yourself, and know that somewhere your mother is watching and believing in every brave choice you make. I love you, Pauline. I always did. I'm sorry I couldn't stay to prove it more." I sat in my office as afternoon light faded to evening, surrounded by evidence of a love I'd thought I'd imagined. The family narrative that I was difficult, ungrateful, inherently less worthy of attention, crumbled completely under the weight of my mother's careful documentation. She'd seen everything. She'd valued everything. And she'd left me these letters like breadcrumbs leading back to the truth of who I'd always been. The mother wound I'd carried my entire life, the belief that I was fundamentally unlovable, began to heal in a way I didn't know was possible. Not because my father had apologized or my sister had changed, but because the person whose opinion mattered most had reached across death to tell me you were always enough. As I carefully returned the letters to their envelopes, I made a decision. It was time to host the first annual Foundation Gala, the event that would launch our work publicly and honor the women we served. And I was going to invite my family to attend not as participants, but as witnesses. They needed to see what their house would become after they were gone, needed to understand the legacy that would outlive their mistakes. 18 months after the Christmas dinner that changed everything, I stood backstage at the historic Riverside Hall, preparing to address 200 people who'd gathered for the inaugural Pauline Boyd Foundation Gala. The venue had once housed a women's shelter in the 1970s, and I'd chosen it deliberately. This building had a history of protecting women, and now it would launch an organization dedicated to continuing that work. Through the curtain, I could see the crowd settling into their seats. Donors who'd contributed significant funds, social workers and therapists who'd partner with us, journalists who'd covered the story. And most significantly, 89 women we'd already helped escape financial abuse situations, women whose stories I knew intimately, whose courage had humbled me daily. In the back section, deliberately not at any head table, sat my family. Richard moved slowly with a cane, the residual effect of his heart attack still visible in his careful movements. Elaine sat beside him, her hand resting protectively on his arm. Madeline occupied the seat on his other side, dressed simply, her expression serious. Their presence generated whispers. Some attendees recognized them from the national coverage, but I'd invited them intentionally. They needed to see what their house would fund when they were gone. They needed to witness the legacy that would outlive all of our mistakes. The program director introduced me, and I walked onto the stage to thunderous applause. The lights were bright, the room warm with body heat and anticipation. I took a breath and began. 18 months ago, I sat at a Christmas dinner table before an empty plate while my family feasted around me. My father had just declared that parasites get no food, and he was looking directly at me when he said it. The room went completely silent. I was 43 years old. I'd built a successful business from nothing. I'd helped my family financially for years. And yet, in that moment, I was reduced to something less than human, a burden, a taker. Something that deserved to be starved. I paused, letting the weight of that image settle. My father called me a parasite because he was terrified I'd realize I didn't need him. And he was right to be terrified I didn't need him. But I'd spent 20 years trying to prove I did because I wanted his love. What I learned is this: you can't earn love from people who see you as a threat. You can't make yourself small enough to deserve care. You can't sacrifice enough to finally be seen. I looked directly at the section where my family sat. Richard's head was bowed. Madeline was crying quietly. Elaine met my eyes with something that looked like pride. But here's what you can do. You can stop participating in your own diminishment. You can set boundaries that hurt but heal. You can choose justice without choosing cruelty. You can walk away from tables where you're not fed and build your own. The applause started, but I held up my hand. This foundation has already helped 89 women escape situations like mine. We've provided legal support, financial counseling, emergency housing, and most importantly, validation that what they experienced was real and wrong. We're opening 3 regional offices next year, and I want to tell you about one more thing we're creating. I gestured to a screen behind me where a photo of my childhood home appeared. When my father passes, the house where I was humiliated will become a transition home for women leaving abusive families. The dining room where I wasn't allowed to eat will serve meals to women rebuilding their lives. That's not revenge. That's redemption of a space that held too much pain. The room erupted in applause. People stood. I saw women wiping their eyes, men nodding and understanding, social workers already imagining how they'd refer clients to us. Then something unexpected happened. Richard stood slowly, using his cane for support, and raised his hand asking to speak. The room went silent. Pauline looked at me, uncertain. I nodded once, granting permission I wasn't sure I should give. Richard's voice shook as he addressed the crowd. My name is Richard Boyd. I'm the father Pauline is too kind to fully expose. I called my daughter a parasite because I couldn't face my own failures. She gave me mercy I'll spend the rest of my life trying to deserve. He paused, struggling with emotion. If you're here because you've experienced what I put her through, I'm sorry. I'm deeply, unforgivably sorry. And to every parent listening, whether you're in this room or hearing this secondhand, don't be me. Love your children before you lose them. Acknowledge their worth while you still can. I lost 20 years with an extraordinary daughter because I was too broken to see what was right in front of me. He sat down heavily, and the room remained silent except for quiet crying from dozens of people. I stood frozen on stage, unsure how to respond to this public moment of accountability I hadn't scripted or anticipated. After the gala, I stood alone on the venue's second-floor balcony, looking out at the city lights. The weight of the evening, the speeches, the tears, the profound sense that we'd created something that would outlive all of us settled over me like a blanket. Your mother would be proud, Elaine's voice said softly as she joined me. I smiled, thinking of the letters. I think she always was. May I join you? Madeline's voice came from the doorway, tentative, respectful of boundaries. I nodded, and she stepped onto the balcony. The three of us stood there, not quite healed, not quite family in the traditional sense, but honest for the first time in our lives. My phone buzzed with an email. Dear Ms. Boyd, I left my abusive father's house today after 30 years. Your story gave me courage. Can you tell me when does it stop hurting? I typed back immediately. When you stop waiting for his permission to know your worth. Welcome to freedom. I looked at the women standing beside me, at the city stretching before us, at the future we were all building in our imperfect ways. My father once said parasites get no food. I said quietly, though I wasn't sure if I was speaking to them, or to myself, or to every woman who'd ever been called less than she was. What he didn't know, and what I'm proud to have proven, is that sometimes the person they call a parasite is actually the root system holding up the entire forest. This isn't revenge, this is rebirth, and every woman who has ever been called too much, too little, or not enough, this is for you. We don't need their tables, we'll build our own. And that's where Pauline Boyd's story brings us tonight. From an empty plate at a Christmas dinner to a foundation that's already changed 89 lives. From being called a parasite to becoming the root system that holds up an entire forest of women finding their strength. But here's what I want you to understand. Pauline's story isn't just her story. It's the story of thousands of women who've sat at tables where they weren't fed, who've given everything to families that gave nothing back, who've been called too much or too little or not enough their entire lives. And if you're listening to this right now, feeling that recognition in your chest, that tightness that says, this is my story too. I want you to know something: you're not alone, you're not crazy, and you're not the problem. Financial abuse within families is one of the most invisible forms of exploitation, because we're taught that family means unconditional support, that blood is thicker than water, that you owe your parents everything simply because they raised you. But Pauline's story shows us a different truth, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in a dynamic that destroys you. That boundaries aren't betrayal. That protecting yourself isn't vindictive. That walking away from a toxic table and building your own is not just acceptable, it's necessary. Now I want to hear from you. Have you experienced something similar to Pauline's story? Have you been the invisible child, the family ATM, the scapegoat who bore everyone's projected pain? Or maybe you're the Madeline in your family, the favored one who's starting to realize that favoritism was its own form of control. Perhaps you're even the Richard, someone who recognizes their own behavior in this story and wants to change before it's too late. Whatever your perspective, I want you to share it in the comments below. Tell me what part of Pauline's story resonated with you most. Was it the Christmas dinner humiliation, the discovery of the stolen inheritance? Richard's diary revealing he knew what he was doing all along. Or was it the ending? The choice to transform pain into purpose, to turn a house of humiliation into a home for healing. And here's a question I especially want your thoughts on. Do you think Pauline made the right choice giving her father a life estate instead of prosecuting him fully? Do you think Richard's public apology was genuine, or was it another form of control? And what about Madeline? Can complicity be redeemed, or are some betrayals too deep to forgive? If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it gave you language for something you've experienced but never knew how to name, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Every week we share stories about women who've chosen themselves when the world told them they were selfish for doing so. Women who've set boundaries when they were told they were being difficult. Women who've walked away from tables where they weren't fed and built something better. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. A daughter who's still trying to earn love that will never come. A mother who's recognizing patterns she wants to break. A friend who's been called a parasite when she's actually been the foundation all along. Because here's the truth, Pauline proved you don't need permission from the people who hurt you to know your worth. You don't need their apology to start healing. You don't need their table to feast. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is build your own table and decide exactly who deserves a seat. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next story.